I heard about the old house from a friend who knew I needed a quieter place. He said it was isolated with a decent patch of land and a solid structure. I expected a normal country home, maybe some dust and creaky floors. But on my first day, I saw that scarecrow leaning against the porch. I didn't like the way it slumped there, half hidden by shadows. Its clothes looked torn and the wide hat covered most of its straw face. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling and told myself it was just a regular scarecrow. It didn't feel regular, though. I drove up in my pickup that afternoon. The sun sat low, and the front yard felt strange. There was a slight chill in the air, even though the day had been warm. I parked by the side of the house and stretched my legs. The place was small, with a wraparound porch that needed fresh paint. The steps creaked, and the floorboards looked scratched in spots. Weeds grew along the edges. The roof seemed okay, at least. I grabbed a couple of boxes from the truck and carried them inside. I glanced over at the scarecrow. It was slumped against the railing, one arm partly raised. The fabric on that sleeve was ripped, and the straw poked through. A big hat drooped down, hiding most of its features. Only a bit of straw poked out from the brim. I tried not to stare. I told myself it was just an old decoration the previous owner left behind. Inside the house, I set down the boxes and looked around. The living room had an old fireplace. The walls needed a fresh coat of paint. There was a faint smell of dust and mildew. I looked out the window toward the porch. I saw the shape of that scarecrow. It made me uneasy, but I wasn't sure why. I told myself to stop being dramatic. It was just straw and cloth. Over the next few hours, I hauled more boxes inside. I arranged some furniture. My back started to ache. By sundown, I was sweating and tired. That first evening, I considered dragging the scarecrow off the porch and tossing it somewhere else, but I didn't have the energy. I thought I'd leave it for the next day. The sun dipped behind the trees, and I flipped on a single lamp in the living room. It glowed weakly, but it was enough to see what I was doing. I decided to call it a night. I made a quick sandwich in the tiny kitchen and ate standing up. The counters were old with chipped tiles. A draft pushed through the window frame. I heard the wind rustle outside. When I flicked off the lights and headed for the bedroom, I felt a weird sense of being watched. The front door had a small window, but I'd covered it with an old curtain for the night. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that something waited on the other side. I got to bed around 11. The room was dim, lit only by a moonbeam cutting through the thin curtains. I listened to my own breathing. My mattress lay on the floor since I hadn't set up a bed frame yet. The walls felt closer in the dark. I tried to ignore every squeak and tap in the house. It was an old place, bound to make sounds. Then I heard something on the porch. It sounded like a soft scrape, as if a light object dragged across wood. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but I got up quietly and approached the bedroom window. I pulled the curtain aside a little and looked out. The porch was partially visible from there, but I couldn't see the scarecrow. My heart pounded in my chest. I stared for a while, waiting for movement. Eventually, I gave up and tried to sleep. I woke up at dawn feeling stiff. I rubbed my eyes and got dressed in jeans and a shirt. I went out to the porch. My heart skipped when I saw the scarecrow. It was still leaning there, but it looked angled differently, as though it had been shifted. I guessed maybe the wind had pushed it. Then I noticed something on the third step down. A small bird lay there dead. Another one sat 2 steps below it. Both looked untouched except for some bent feathers. No sign of blood or anything else. It was almost like they'd been placed there. My stomach tightened. I went down the steps, carefully stepping around the birds. The morning air felt cold on my face. I didn't see any footprints or signs of an animal. I grabbed a shovel from the shed and buried the little birds near a patch of dirt out back. I didn't like seeing them. I didn't want them on my porch. Then I went around to the truck and began unloading more stuff. By mid-morning, I decided to do something about that scarecrow. I walked up to it and tried to move it. The straw arm was stiff, and the whole thing felt heavier than I expected. I noticed the clothes were tied tightly to a wooden frame beneath. The cloth smelled musty. The big hat flopped over, and I glimpsed a rough burlap face. No real features, just 2 sewn-up slits and a stitched-up mouth. The workmanship looked old. The straw in the body was yellowed and dry, like it had sat out in the sun for years. I carried it into the backyard, planning to prop it against the fence. Something about it made me uneasy, like I was carrying something I shouldn't. I dropped it near a low spot in the yard. I said out loud, "Stay there," as a dumb joke to calm my nerves. Then I went back to the house. As I walked onto the porch, I noticed faint scratches on the floorboards. They formed half circles, like something had been dragged. It matched the pattern of the scarecrow's frame. That didn't make sense. I had never dragged it across the porch. I picked it up and moved it in my arms. So why those marks? I shook the feeling off and spent the rest of the day cleaning inside. I hammered a few loose floorboards. I wiped dust off the windows and set up my kitchen table. Time passed quickly. By evening, I realized the sun was going down again. The house felt quiet. I cooked myself a small meal of eggs and toast and ate in silence. I tried to distract myself by playing music on my phone, but my mind drifted to the scarecrow outside. I double-checked the back door and made sure it was locked. I peeked through the window. The yard was dim with just a bit of moonlight. I could see the dark outline of the scarecrow near the fence. I felt a chill down my arms. I turned away and headed to my bedroom. That night, sleep came slowly. About an hour in, I thought I heard a sound, a faint scraping like the night before. My throat felt tight. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I decided I had to check. I left the bedroom and grabbed a flashlight from the table. My bare feet made the floor squeak. The living room was pitch black except for a distant glow from outside. I stood at the front door listening. Then I heard a dull thump. It came from the porch. I opened the door a crack and shone the flashlight. I expected to see an animal or maybe the wind rocking something against the railing. Instead, I saw the scarecrow slouched against the door. The wooden frame pressed against the porch boards. The arm with the torn sleeve was half raised, like it was pushing on the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out. I flashed the light on its face. The hat had slipped back a bit, revealing the burlap cloth. I swear it looked like the stitched mouth was parted, but maybe that was the angle of the fabric. I wanted to slam the door and lock it, but I forced myself to step outside. My breathing was shaky. I grabbed the scarecrow by the arm and dragged it off the porch. I pulled it around the side of the house, near the trash bins. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to leave it out front. Once I let go, it sort of toppled forward, landing with a muffled thud on the ground. The hat fell off. I picked it up and placed it back on the head, feeling a weird urge to keep it covered. Then I hurried inside, locked the door, and tried to calm myself. I slept badly for the rest of the night, waking up from every little noise. When I got up in the morning, I went to check on the scarecrow. It wasn't behind the trash bins. My stomach lurched and I checked around the yard. I eventually found it leaning on the fence again, exactly where I left it the first time. I walked closer. The hat was askew. The frame looked scuffed and dirty. I stared at it, trying to see if maybe someone had come onto my property to prank me. There were no footprints except my own. I felt paranoid and on edge. The next few days passed in a tense routine. I tried to focus on repairs and ignored the scarecrow as much as possible. In the mornings, I often found new scratches on the porch boards. Sometimes I found small dead birds on the steps. I still didn't hear any violent noises at night, just occasional scraping or tapping. Each time I'd discover the scarecrow closer to the house. I'd move it away, then find it back again. I tried tying it to a post. It ended up on the porch anyway. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot and I started second-guessing everything. Maybe I was losing it, or maybe there was some weird trick going on. One evening, I decided to stay up all night and watch from the window. Around 2 a.m., I sat in the living room with the lights off. The darkness felt oppressive. I used a small flashlight just to see my watch. At about 2:30, I heard the porch steps creak. My heart pounded. I inched over to the window. The moonlight was faint, but I saw a shape move up the steps. It was the scarecrow. It looked like it was half standing, half lurching. The wooden frame squeaked. Its arm reached out in slow jerks. Each step caused a dull thud on the boards. I froze in place. I wanted to rush out, but fear locked my legs. I heard the doorknob rattle. There was a light scrape, then silence. Eventually, I heard a soft dragging sound, like the thing was moving away. I waited a long time before I dared to peek out again. By then, the porch was empty. I saw fresh scratches near the door in the morning. I realized I couldn't live like this. I decided I had to remove that scarecrow for good. I checked the barn that came with the property. I found an old fire pit outside near some stacked bricks. I lugged the scarecrow there that afternoon. My hands trembled as I piled wood around it. I tried to light it, but the wood was a bit damp, so it took a while. The flame finally caught and I stood back. Smoke rose around the scarecrow's frame. The burlap face blackened. The straw crackled and the cloth burned. The smell was pungent. I felt sweat bead on my forehead, even though the fire wasn't huge. I waited until the flames died down. Only scraps of wood and bits of ash remained. For a moment, I felt relief. I tossed water on the embers and turned to go back inside. My nerves were still jangled, but I hoped I'd broken whatever hold that thing had on the house. That evening, I ate dinner without feeling the usual tension. I locked the doors out of habit, but I felt more confident. I turned in early and slept pretty well. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the house. I jumped out of bed and went to the window. At first, I saw nothing. The yard looked normal. Then I went to the kitchen and checked the back window. I saw straw scattered in the yard. A charred wooden stick lay near the fence, blackened at one end. I felt a chill. It looked like part of the scarecrow's frame. I slid the window open. A breeze stirred the straw. It moved in small clumps like it wasn't quite settled. I walked outside, keeping my eyes on the scattered remains. My pulse pounded. I thought I smelled old smoke and musty fabric. I felt like something still lingered. I checked the porch, and sure enough, there were new scratches, deep ones. They led all the way to the door. I noticed 2 small dead birds on the top step again. I backed away, my throat tight. I felt cornered. I decided enough was enough. If destroying it by fire didn't work, I needed to leave. I threw my clothes into a suitcase. I grabbed my important papers, my laptop, and whatever else I could fit in the truck. I locked the doors out of habit, even though I doubted that would help. I jumped in the driver's seat, started the engine, and took off. My heart was racing so fast I felt lightheaded. I didn't care if I lost money on that house. I wanted to be as far away from there as possible. I drove down the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror. The house shrank behind me, the porch barely visible. I caught a glimpse of something near the railing, like a shape with a wide hat. Then the turn in the road blocked my view. I kept driving. I forced my eyes on the road, ignoring the knot in my gut. I refused to slow down until I reached the main highway. I don't know who put that scarecrow there or why it seemed to move on its own. I only know it didn't want me in that house. Maybe it was some old curse or some twisted piece of local folklore. I'm not going back to find out. I left that place behind, along with the birds on the steps and the dragging sounds at night. Even now, I feel a chill when I think of it. I don't care if I never see a scarecrow again in my life. I'd rather forget the way its wooden arms scraped the boards, the way it always found its way back to the porch, and the cold dread that took over whenever I saw it propped there. That place is someone else's problem now. I'm done. I walked into the lobby with my clipboard in hand, ready to assess the place. The manager had warned me about the attic, but he didn't explain why. He just said something about strange noises and old junk. I'm used to old junk. Most of my projects involve peeling paint, sagging floors, and leaky roofs. I didn't expect laughter. And I definitely didn't expect to see those masks. I climbed the stairs to the top floor. The railing felt shaky under my palm, and the air smelled like stale mothballs. There were patches of water damage on the walls, and the paint had bubbled in a few spots. Whenever I see that, I note it down. I need to check the insulation, maybe the gutters, find the cause of the leaks. Simple enough, I thought. I just had to get a clear idea of the structural problems so I could give the manager a detailed plan. At the end of the hallway, I found a narrow door marked storage. Behind it, a set of wooden steps led up to the attic. The steps creaked under my weight, each one a sharp groan that reminded me of an old rocking chair. The higher I went, the darker it got. I could feel the dust on my face. My eyes burned and I tried not to sneeze. The overhead bulb flickered, but it was enough to see the wooden rafters crossing above. When I reached the attic, I paused at the top step and scanned the space. It looked large, with low slanting ceilings. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, and old furniture was scattered around. A faint smell of rotted fabric and damp cardboard drifted in the air. My boots crunched on something that felt like dead insects, maybe old beetle shells or bits of plaster. There was a single window at the far end. It looked grimy, letting in a weak beam of light that fell across the floor. I took a few steps forward and heard a scraping sound in the corner. My heart sped up. I've dealt with rats before, but that didn't sound like a rat. It sounded bigger or maybe just heavier. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but nothing moved. I exhaled and checked my watch. I wanted to get this over with quickly. I started my inspection. I looked at the rafters, checked for any obvious cracks, and examined the inside of the roof. The crossbeams seemed sturdy enough, but I spotted signs of mildew, so I made a note on my clipboard. Then I heard a laugh. It sounded like someone choking. It wasn't deep. It was high-pitched in a weird, scratchy way. It lasted for about 2 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I froze and listened. Nothing else. I waited a few more seconds. My flashlight pointed toward the far side of the attic. Then I heard another laugh. It came from somewhere to my left this time, behind a pile of stacked chairs. I wanted to call out, but I also felt uneasy. If there was a trespasser, I needed to handle it calmly. So I took one step at a time toward the chairs. My pulse felt strong in my ears. I reached the chairs and moved them aside, trying to avoid the big cobwebs. I found no one behind them. The dust in the air made it hard to see much. I stepped around an old table and aimed my flashlight at the next corner. The laughter started up again, this time from behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight beam wobbled across the floor and a stack of crates. I didn't see anyone. I told myself it must be the wind or some old pipe. Buildings can make strange noises, especially when they're as neglected as this one. So I decided to ignore it and keep checking the structure. I walked further toward the rear of the attic. The gloom thickened and the light from the lone window faded. I found a row of dusty shelves on the back wall. On those shelves, I saw something strange, a few old masks hanging by nails. There were 4 of them, each shaped like a face twisted into an exaggerated expression. One had bulging eyes and a gaping mouth, another had a crooked grin, the third had sunken cheeks and a frown, and the last one had wide, round eye holes that almost looked surprised. They looked handmade, like someone had molded them out of plaster or some kind of clay. The paint was chipped, and the edges were cracked. I stepped closer and felt a cold draft on my neck. My eyes watered from the dust, but I couldn't look away from the masks. Each one had tiny holes for the eyes and nose, and I swore I saw movement inside those holes. My flashlight was steady, but I could have sworn the shadows around the eyes twitched, like something living was inside. I exhaled and blinked a few times. I tapped one mask lightly with my flashlight. It swung a bit, then settled back. No movement, just dust. I told myself I was imagining things. I turned around to go back to the main area, and something tugged the bottom of my pant leg. It felt like a small hand or a claw. It wasn't a snag on a loose nail. It was an actual pull, a yank that made me stumble half a step. My throat tightened. I aimed my flashlight down at my legs, but there was nothing there, just the dusty floor and my own boots. I stood still for several seconds. My breath held, and listened. The attic was quiet. I felt sweat on my forehead. I decided to ignore it and pressed on with my inspection. But my hands were shaky now. I checked a few more rafters near the back, noted the signs of moisture damage, and stepped around some large boxes. Then I felt the tug again. This time it was weaker, like a playful tug. I jerked my leg away and spun around, shining my flashlight in a wide arc. I caught a glimpse of something near the wall. It flickered in the light, then disappeared behind a trunk. It looked like a faint outline of a shape, but I couldn't be sure. My heart was hammering. I felt a chill in my chest. I wanted to get out of there, but I also knew I needed to finish my work. I forced myself to walk over to that trunk. I lifted the lid with one hand, flashlight in the other. Inside, I found old documents, a few torn curtains, and some random junk. Nothing unusual. I closed the trunk. Then I heard a scraping sound from behind me. It was that same laugh, but now it was broken up, like 2 or 3 voices overlapping. It ended with a heavy breath, almost like a sigh. I called out, "Who's there?" But no one answered. I walked back toward the masks. My shoes left footprints in the thick layer of dust. I saw my footprints crossing over themselves from before, but there were other marks too. They looked like small streaks or lines where the dust had been pushed aside. I crouched down and touched one mark with my fingertip. It didn't feel like an animal track. It felt like something dragged a tiny object through the dust, making a narrow trail. I stood up again, swallowing hard. That's when I noticed that the masks had shifted. Earlier, they hung in a neat row, each one spaced evenly apart. Now, 2 of them were closer together, like they had been moved. I looked around for anything that could have knocked them, but there was nothing near the shelf. I tried to tell myself I was mistaken, that maybe I misread the spacing, but I knew something was off. A sudden dull thud echoed from across the attic. I pointed my flashlight toward the noise. A stack of boxes toppled over, scattering old newspapers on the floor. The newspapers slid in my direction, carried by a faint breeze. I smelled something stale in the air, like wet cardboard and rancid glue. My hand shook a little as I walked over to the boxes, stepping carefully around the scattered papers. There was nothing behind them but the wall, and I saw no holes or vents. I couldn't figure out where the breeze came from. I remember my chest tightening at that point. My scalp prickled. My ears felt warm. I decided to wrap up as fast as possible. I looked at the rafters one more time, then started to head back. But the pull on my pant leg came again. It was insistent now, almost like it wanted me to stay. I kicked my foot out and said, "Stop!" My voice came out louder than I expected. I stood still, breathing hard. Then the laughter started up again, this time to my left and right at the same moment, as though there were several of these things around me, hidden behind the furniture and boxes. I made a run for the attic door. My flashlight beam bobbed up and down, and I felt the dusty floor giving way under me slightly. The boards creaked. It felt like something was behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept going until I reached the stairs. The door was still open. I almost tripped on the top step in my hurry. I clattered down the wooden steps. The flickering light bulb above barely lit the way. When I got to the hallway, I let out a shaky breath. My hands felt clammy. My shirt stuck to my back. I opened my clipboard, intending to jot something down about the roof issues, but my mind was racing. I needed a minute. Then I heard a soft scraping sound from the other side of the attic door. It sounded like nails scratching wood. I stared at that door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. I closed the door firmly and slid the latch in place. I walked down the hallway, each step quick. My breathing was unsteady. I wanted to get back to the manager's office and tell him I'd be back tomorrow with a plan. But when I reached the elevator, I paused. The building's old mechanical system hummed quietly. I could feel a slight vibration in the floor. I pressed the button, but the elevator took a while to arrive. Standing there, I felt an itch on the back of my neck, like someone was touching me again, though no one was there. When the elevator doors opened, I got in fast and punched the ground floor button. As the doors slid shut, I caught a glimpse of the end of the hallway. The attic door was still latched, but the overhead light flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a mask peeking around the corner. I might have imagined it. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, and the elevator door closed. On the ride down, I wiped my forehead with my sleeve. The building's interior groaned with the motion of the elevator shaft. I smelled that stale air again, or maybe it was my imagination. My arms felt heavy, and my shoulders were tense. I tapped my foot, counting the seconds until the doors would open again. Finally, the elevator reached the lobby. When I stepped out, the manager was waiting behind the reception desk. He asked, "Everything okay? You look a bit pale." I forced a small laugh and said I was fine, just dusty. He mentioned again that no one goes into the attic except me now, because it was part of our agreement. I told him I'd have a report soon. Then I walked out. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk and took a deep breath. The late afternoon sun felt warm on my face. The traffic on the street was steady, and a few pedestrians passed by. Nobody paid attention to me. I tried to shove the memory of the laughter out of my head. I told myself it was just a strange echo in an old building. But I kept picturing those masks, especially the one with the gaping mouth. It gave me the impression that it was always watching. That night, I sat at my dining table with the building's blueprint spread out. I marked areas that needed reinforcement, took note of the places where moisture damage was worst, and wrote down the approximate costs for repairs. My pen felt slippery in my hand. I got up a few times to pour a glass of water, just trying to shake off that nervous feeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shapes in the attic or imagined that tug on my pants. I decided to visit the site again the next day, but only in the morning. I wanted more sunlight up there. The manager gave me an extra key so I could enter the building on my own schedule. I arrived at about 10 in the morning. The place was quieter than before, with only a couple of workers around removing debris from the lower floors. I nodded to them and headed upstairs again. This time, the hallway leading to the attic felt slightly less intimidating. But when I approached the attic door, I noticed the latch was undone. I'd locked it the day before. I pushed the door open and climbed the steps carefully. The overhead bulb still flickered. The attic looked the same, except I saw fresh footprints in the dust. My footprints from yesterday and a few sets of smudges I didn't recognize. I stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand again, and listened. No laughter, no dragging sounds, but the air felt heavy. I walked to the back wall where the masks had been. I counted 4 nails. 3 masks were hanging there. The 4th was gone. My stomach sank. I scanned the floor for any sign of it. Nothing. I stepped around the shelves, crouched, checked behind some boxes. Nothing. I decided I'd seen enough. I walked back to the stairs, determined to finish my final notes on the structure from below. As I started down, the overhead bulb flickered again, and I thought I caught a glimpse of movement near the window. I paused for a second. The sunlight through the dirty glass highlighted the dust motes in the air. Then I heard a click, like a door latch snapping shut. I spun around and the attic door behind me was still open, but something up there felt different. I finished going down the steps. I left the attic door open, not caring if anyone complained. I heard one soft laugh behind me as I hurried back down the hallway, but I didn't stop to investigate. This time I didn't bother with the elevator. I jogged down the main staircase. My footsteps echoed in the stairwell, and each echo made me glance over my shoulder. Once I reached the lobby, I told the manager about the missing mask. He looked confused and said he'd never seen any masks up there. I told him I needed to finalize my plan from the ground floor, and he shrugged. I spent the rest of the day checking the lower levels, trying to keep my mind off the attic. But I knew I'd have to go back at some point. Something was up there. I didn't know if it was several people messing around or something else. I only knew it didn't want me disturbing its space. Later that evening, I gathered my notes in the manager's office. He asked me how soon I could start the actual renovation. I told him I needed a couple of days to finalize the attic's details. He nodded. I could see he was curious, but he didn't push. I stepped outside into the cool air and locked the main door behind me with the key he'd given me. When I looked up, I could see the row of attic windows. One of them was the dusty one I'd peered through earlier. For a second, I thought I saw a shape behind the glass, maybe a face, but it was too quick to be sure. I felt a chill in my arms. I stood on the sidewalk again, just like the day before. Cars passed by, honking, and a group of office workers walked past, chatting about something trivial. I stuffed the key in my jacket pocket and headed to my car. As I opened the door, I felt that same sense of unease, like something was behind me, watching me. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing, but I caught a reflection in the car window. My own face, pale and tense. I got in, started the engine, and told myself I'd handle the attic carefully. I decided I might bring someone else next time, maybe one of the work crew. I needed to keep it professional. I couldn't run away from a job because of strange noises and odd masks. But the thought of going back up there made my stomach knot. I drove away, trying not to look in the rearview mirror too often. I planned to spend the evening reviewing my notes, triple-checking the blueprint. But I knew I couldn't ignore the attic. There was more going on up there than just old junk. And the missing mask bothered me. Something had taken it. Something that tugged on my pants, laughed in raspy voices, and left streaks in the dust. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and told myself I'd figure it out. I had no choice. I never thought I'd stumble on a hidden room in my own house. I had bought this place 2 years ago. It was old, and parts of it felt neglected. The roof leaked sometimes, and the basement walls showed signs of water damage. Nothing too serious, but enough to make me realize I needed to invest in a decent renovation. My plan was simple: tear down a few walls, update the wiring, and get rid of some moldy insulation. I hired a contractor, and we started the work. On the second week, I decided to handle the basement myself. That's where everything changed. I was removing some loose tiles near the old utility closet. There was a gap in the wall about the size of my hand. At first, I thought it was just poor construction. Then I noticed something behind it, a hollow space. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it through the gap. I saw red bricks in the distance, forming a narrow corridor. My heart raced. I felt a sudden chill, even though it was mid-afternoon and the basement was usually warm from the furnace. I knocked on the outer wall and it sounded different, like there was a room back there. My contractor told me this place had no records of any additional rooms. But that night I couldn't stop thinking about that gap. I wanted to see what was behind it. I got a hammer and a chisel the next morning, told the contractor I needed some private time to check something, and I started widening the hole. Dust flew everywhere. My throat burned from the old debris. Every time I struck the wall, I heard echoes behind it, like a faint thud repeating itself. After an hour, I opened a space big enough to step through. I shone my flashlight in, and I saw a narrow passage leading to what looked like a small chamber. I crawled through carefully. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I kept telling myself not to panic. The chamber was about 10 feet by 10 feet with low ceilings. The walls were made of exposed brick. There were marks on the bricks. At first, I thought it was graffiti or some old worker's signature. When I got closer, I realized these were carvings, geometric shapes, interlaced patterns, and words that made no sense to me. They were in a script I had never seen. Some looked like triangles stacked on top of each other. Others looked like lines twisting around small circles. The words had harsh angles, with lines crossing back and forth. I ran my fingers over one symbol. It felt rough and uneven. My skin prickled, and I felt a small jolt like static electricity. I took pictures with my phone. I wanted to study them later. Then I noticed a strange smell. It was musty, like damp earth. But there was another layer to it, almost metallic. I checked the floor. It was concrete, stained in several spots, but I couldn't tell if it was water damage or something else. The ceiling had wooden beams that looked older than the rest of the house's structure. That alone was strange. My house wasn't that old, but this secret room felt like it belonged to another era. I decided to leave the room alone for the rest of the day. I sealed it up with a piece of plywood so dust wouldn't spread. When I went upstairs, I noticed that my hands were shaking. I couldn't focus on anything else. During dinner, I kept replaying the images of those symbols. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was some kind of old wine cellar or storage space. But then, Why carve all those strange marks? That night, I heard a loud bang around 2 a.m. I jumped out of bed. My heart pounded. I listened for another sound, but all I heard was the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I couldn't fall back asleep for an hour. I kept feeling an uneasy tightness in my chest, like I was expecting something bad to happen. The next morning, I sent the contractor to work on the upper floor so I could have the basement to myself again. I wanted to do some online research. I sat on a folding chair near the hidden room entrance with my laptop on my knees. I tried looking up geometric symbols and unknown scripts. Most of it led me to random websites about ancient alphabets or occult practices. Nothing matched the carvings exactly. But I found a forum where people shared photos of weird markings found in old buildings. I posted one of my pictures. Within an hour, I got a reply from someone who claimed these symbols were part of an old Hermetic tradition. They didn't give me much detail, just said it was dangerous stuff, and that I should leave it alone. I laughed a little, but part of me felt uneasy reading that. While I was replying to comments, I heard a door slam upstairs. I froze. The contractor was supposed to be in the other room painting. There was no reason for a door to slam like that. I went upstairs and the contractor asked if I had closed any door. I said no. He shrugged, said maybe it was a draft. But there was no breeze outside. It was a warm and still day. Back downstairs, I tried reading more about poltergeist activity, out of curiosity. Most sites said that if you believe in it, you start noticing every little noise. I tried to stay rational. Still, I felt unsettled. I grabbed my flashlight and went back into the secret room. I wanted to see if I missed anything. The air felt heavier this time, like there was less oxygen. I saw the carvings again, and I swear they looked slightly different. One of the symbols seemed deeper, like someone had carved it more since yesterday. I touched it and it felt fresh, like the edges were sharper than before. My stomach tightened. I backed away and nearly tripped over some loose brick on the floor. I went upstairs and decided to take a break. I watched some TV, tried to focus on a cooking show, but I couldn't keep my mind off the secret room. After a while, I realized the contractor had left for lunch. The house felt too quiet. Then I heard a scratching sound near the basement steps, like nails dragging on wood. My palms got sweaty. I stood up, walked to the top of the basement stairs, and listened. Silence. I flipped on the basement light. The scratching stopped. I stared down, waiting to see if anything moved. The stairs were empty. I turned off the light, but as soon as I did, the scratching resumed. I flipped the light back on and it stopped again. My breathing got faster. I felt my pulse throbbing in my neck. I took a few steps down, feeling the wood creak under my feet. The scratching got louder. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall. I pushed on the drywall, but it was solid. I felt a strange vibration in my fingertips, like a faint buzz. It faded after a few seconds. Then everything was quiet. I went back up, sat on the couch and rubbed my hands on my jeans, trying to calm down. Over the next few days, odd things kept happening. The contractor reported that the windows rattled in the living room whenever he stepped away. I heard faint voices in the hallway, but when I checked, no one was there. I woke up a few nights covered in sweat, certain I had heard someone breathing beside me, but I was alone. My laptop started acting up whenever I researched the symbols, glitching or freezing, as if something was trying to stop me from learning more. Eventually, I downloaded some old texts from obscure corners of the internet. I found references to curses and seals, to ancient rites meant to lock away entities. A lot of it sounded like paranoid rambling, but the pictures they included showed symbols similar to what I had in that room. I felt a mix of excitement and fear. On one hand, I wanted to decipher everything. On the other, I worried I might trigger something beyond my control. I printed out a few pages, took them down to the chamber and compared them with the carvings. Some lines seemed to match. The shapes lined up with certain geometric patterns I saw in the texts. That's when I noticed that the faint light from my flashlight made the carvings appear to shift. The lines almost seemed to ripple against the bricks. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. But every time I moved the flashlight, the shapes wavered. I felt my scalp tighten and my mouth went dry. I held the beam in one spot. I could have sworn the markings were changing positions, like they were sliding around on the wall. I backed out slowly. My knees felt weak, and I had to lean on the wall to steady myself. I wanted to lock that room up and never go back, but curiosity kept gnawing at me. That evening, the contractor told me he was almost done with the rest of the house. He asked if I wanted him to seal up that basement closet. I lied and said I was planning to turn it into a storage area, so he didn't need to worry about it. In truth, I didn't want him to see what was going on. I was embarrassed, and I also felt protective of the secret. I felt drawn to that room, like I had to figure it out. 2 nights later, I found myself unable to sleep again. Around midnight, I went downstairs with a single lamp and my notes. The basement felt colder than usual. The lamp cast a weak glow, creating flickering shadows on the concrete floor. As I approached the secret entrance, I noticed a soft vibration in the air, like a low hum. I stepped inside the chamber, set the lamp on the floor, and crouched near the wall to examine the carvings. I tried to match them with the printouts. When I traced my finger along one line, I felt a slight movement in the brick itself. I jerked my hand back. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The humming grew louder. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. One of the symbols glowed faintly. It was a dull red, like a dying ember. I leaned in, my hand shaking. I wanted to confirm I wasn't imagining it. It pulsed just once, then it faded. I ran out of the room, nearly knocking over the lamp. My chest heaved when I reached the top of the stairs. My arms were tingling. My mind raced with questions. I tried to calm myself by gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I forced myself to drink some water and breathe slowly. But I couldn't convince myself nothing was happening. I knew it was real. The next day, I woke up feeling drained. My head throbbed. I considered calling someone to check out the room, maybe a local historian or an architect, but I had a strong sense of caution. If these carvings were part of some old practice meant to keep something sealed, maybe I shouldn't bring in outsiders. I decided to keep researching on my own. As I got deeper into those texts, I found repeated warnings. People wrote about symbols that acted as locks, about places where energy gathered and manifested. They said that once you disturb these places, the seal weakens. The descriptions matched the kind of activity I was experiencing: doors slamming, objects moving, voices that weren't there. My stomach twisted when I realized I might be slowly weakening whatever barrier was in that chamber. I tried to rationalize again. But that night, the poltergeist-like events escalated. My bedroom door slammed 3 times in quick succession while I was brushing my teeth. The shower faucet turned on by itself, spraying cold water. I felt my hair stand on end as I approached it to shut it off. The air smelled stale, like old basement dust. I dried my hands and walked into the hallway, and I heard a faint whisper behind me. My nerves were shot. I just wanted peace. I went down to the secret room one last time. I carried a heavy-duty flashlight and a stack of boards. My plan was to block off the passage for good. I stood in front of the carvings, shining my light on them. They looked more pronounced, like the lines had been cut deeper into the brick. The humming started again, and the floor felt like it was vibrating under my shoes. My eyes watered. I felt a strong urge to read every word on that wall, to understand it fully. Part of me wanted to place my hand on the largest symbol and see if it would respond to my touch again, but a stronger sense of fear made me hesitate. I thought about the slamming doors, the voices, the feeling that I was never alone anymore. I didn't want this to continue. I backed away, never taking my eyes off the carvings. Then I started placing boards over the gap. I hammered nails, sealing up the passage. Each swing of the hammer felt like it took more effort than usual, like the air was thicker. When the last board was in place, the humming quieted. I could still feel a slight vibration in my ears, like the aftermath of standing near a loudspeaker. I left the basement, turning off the lights behind me, and locked the door at the top of the stairs. It's been a week since then. I haven't heard any doors slam. The windows are steady. I still feel uneasy, and I occasionally catch myself glancing at the basement door. Sometimes I hear a faint tapping down there, but it stops when I get too close. I haven't opened the sealed room. My contractor finished his work and left. The renovations are basically done except for that one hidden space. I'm torn between wanting to forget it ever existed and feeling a pull to uncover more. But I can't deny that things calmed down after I boarded it up. So, for now, I'm leaving it alone. I keep my research hidden away. I don't talk about it with friends. If I sense something stirring, I go outside until it passes. The house feels like mine again, mostly. I don't know what's behind those carvings or where they came from, but after experiencing the doors slamming, the windows shaking, and the voices echoing at night, I'm convinced there's something in that chamber that isn't meant to be disturbed. I've learned my lesson. Sometimes it's better to leave old secrets buried and sealed. I wasn't expecting anything strange when I unlocked my door after 2 weeks out of town. I figured I'd walk in, drop my bags, and crash on my couch. But as soon as I flipped on the living room light, I saw these faint wet outlines on my wall. They looked like someone had pressed a body against the paint. I stood there staring because it didn't make any sense. It wasn't a spill, and it wasn't water from a leak. It had a human shape, almost like a person had leaned there, arms at the sides. I checked the ceiling for a burst pipe or something. Everything looked normal. The outline was just there, a little darker than the rest of the wall, and kind of glossy when I moved closer. I put my bags down and touched it with my fingertips. My hand came away damp, almost slimy. I wiped my fingers on a paper towel. That's when I noticed more of those outlines near the baseboard, kind of stretched out on the floor. It was like someone had lain down in a fetal position. It spooked me, but I tried to convince myself it was just some weird condensation, or maybe a prank by the neighbor with a sense of humor. It felt wrong, though. The shapes were too precise. I pulled out some cleaning wipes and tried to scrub one of the spots on the floor. The moisture smeared around, but didn't completely go away. I pressed harder and eventually it seemed to fade a bit. I spent the next half hour going around my living room, wiping down each shape I could find. They weren't all the same size or pose. One looked like it had bent knees. Another looked like it had an arm stretched up, almost as if waving. When I was done, I was irritated, tired, and confused, but I didn't feel like dealing with any more. I just wanted to take a shower and forget about it. That night, I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. I thought about calling a friend or my landlord, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I told myself I'd call an inspector in the morning. I turned off the lights, closed my eyes, and tried to fall asleep. Around midnight, I started hearing soft dripping sounds. At first, I thought it was a faucet in the kitchen. Then I realized it was more like random droplets hitting the floor in different parts of the apartment. It wasn't steady. Sometimes I heard it near my closet door, then near the bathroom, then somewhere in the living room. I rolled onto my side, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. I got up, turned on the lights, and walked around the apartment. I checked my sink. It was dry. Toilet wasn't running. Shower wasn't leaking. The sound seemed to move, and I couldn't figure out where it came from. Then I looked at the hallway wall. Another shape was there, about the size of a full-grown person. It glistened under the overhead light. I put my hand on it. Wet, cold, and a little sticky. It was too late to call anyone, and I felt my stomach tighten. I grabbed more wipes and tried to clean it. My arms started shaking from the effort. I was annoyed, but I was also getting nervous. Why did it keep showing up? I managed to sleep a few hours, but I felt drained the next morning. I walked to my kitchen and saw fresh stains along the counter. They looked like handprints, maybe 4 or 5, scattered around the edge where you'd place your palms if you were leaning forward. I checked my own hands, thinking I might have somehow caused that in the middle of the night. My hands were dry. The prints were larger than my hands. They also had a faint shimmer, and they left a slimy residue when I ran a paper towel over them. I called my landlord around 9 in the morning. I tried to keep calm. I told him I was dealing with these wet stains that looked like body outlines, and he sounded skeptical. He said maybe there was a humidity problem or mold. He told me to open my windows, let some air flow, and see if it dried out. He also mentioned he'd try to schedule a maintenance guy, but he wasn't sure when. I hung up feeling annoyed, but I opened my windows and hoped it would help. I spent the rest of the day poking around the apartment, looking for hidden leaks. I pulled my fridge away from the wall, checked behind the washing machine, opened the bathroom cabinet. Everything looked normal. No puddles, no cracked pipes. The only thing I found was more of those silhouettes. They showed up in random spots. Sometimes they looked like someone was in mid-step, as if frozen in a dance move. In one corner, it looked like two figures overlapping, like they were wrestling or maybe hugging. I tried to keep calm, but every new shape made my chest feel tight. Cleaning them became a routine for me over the next couple of days. I would wake up, check the walls and floor, wipe down anything that appeared, and then go about my day. I started to notice these shapes forming faster, sometimes while I was in another room. I'd hear a faint wet squelch or maybe a soft hiss, and I'd rush to see a brand new shape on a wall that was clean minutes ago. I couldn't figure out how it was happening. It was like something was moving through the apartment, leaving these outlines behind. 3 nights in, I was watching TV with all the lights on. I had this feeling of being watched, which made no sense because the apartment was empty. I heard a shuffle near my doorway, and I snapped my head around. For a split second, I saw a shape in the dark. It looked like a pale figure about my height with dark, shiny eyes. Then it was gone. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, but I checked the floor near the door and found a fresh, wet silhouette. It had the shape of someone standing with an arm raised, like they were about to knock on a door. My heart started pounding. I stood there, feeling my pulse throbbing in my temples, and I just stared at that outline. It felt like I was losing my mind. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the landlord again or maybe a friend, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I was seeing these wet ghosts? No one would believe me. I decided to keep it together for a bit longer. I wiped up the new shape and put a folded towel against the spot, hoping to dry it out more. I crawled into bed and tried to sleep with the lights on, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard faint footsteps. My arms and legs felt tense. My scalp prickled. I lay there with my eyes wide open, waiting for something else to happen. A couple more days passed. Every time I wiped down a shape, a new one appeared somewhere else. They were getting larger. Some reached almost from floor to ceiling. Others were smaller, like a crouched person ready to leap. The positions reminded me of some kind of strange dance or maybe a series of fight moves. I tried to stay away from the apartment as much as possible. I went to work early. I stayed out late. But eventually, I had to come back. One evening, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. I froze. The feeling was like a damp hand trying to grip me. I whipped around and saw nothing. But on the floor, right where I had been standing, there was a fresh outline that looked like a pair of hands, angled as if reaching up. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I staggered back, grabbed the dish towel, and started wiping. The shape clung to the floor, and it took me a few minutes to get it to fade. That night, I tried to fall asleep with headphones on, hoping to block out any weird noises. I dozed off for maybe an hour. Then I jolted awake with a heavy pressure on my chest. It felt cold and sticky, like a wet blanket pressing down. I tried to sit up, but I felt something grip my forearms. I gasped. I couldn't see it clearly, but I sensed a shape leaning over me, and I felt warm breath on my cheek. My heart was racing, and I strained to lift my arms. Then the pressure lifted, and I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp. My sheets had wet marks on them, shaped like two hands and a chest. My own chest felt damp, and I wiped at my t-shirt, which had a slimy residue. I was done pretending this was normal. I called a friend, told him I had a serious problem in my apartment, and asked if I could stay with him for a few nights. He said yes, but I still had a few hours before I could leave. So I tried to gather some essentials. I took a duffel bag out of my closet and started shoving clothes in. As I stuffed a pair of jeans inside, I heard this low, moist sound behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw a wavering figure in the mirror. It was like a faint silhouette, almost translucent, with droplets rolling off its surface. Its face had no clear features, but I sensed it was smiling or maybe sneering. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea. I snapped my head around, but when I looked behind me, there was nothing. The mirror was smeared with water, though. 2 faint handprints were on the glass. I slammed the closet door shut, zipped the bag, and left the bedroom. The living room lights flickered. I looked at the wall near the sofa and saw 3 or 4 outlines forming at once. They were large, overlapping shapes, as if multiple figures were spinning around, arms and legs extended. The walls glistened. It made my stomach turn. I rushed out of the apartment. I spent that night at my friend's place. I told him I had some kind of water issue, and he gave me a funny look, but he didn't push for details. The next morning, I grabbed a guy from a local cleaning service. I paid him extra to come immediately. We went back to my apartment together. I told him I had weird stains that wouldn't go away. He was polite enough not to ask too many questions, but the moment he walked in, he saw the outlines on the walls, floors, and even on the ceiling in some spots. He tried cleaning solutions, steam cleaning, everything he had. The outlines faded a bit, but they started reappearing within minutes. He stared at them, confused, and then gave me a shrug. I paid him anyway and told him I appreciated his help. I called a different inspector recommended by the landlord. He spent an hour checking for leaks, mold, and anything else that could cause moisture. He told me there was no sign of any structural damage or water infiltration. He said everything was dry behind the walls. He had no explanation for the stains. He just shook his head and left. At that point, I was exhausted. I hadn't had a good night's sleep in days, and I felt like the apartment was suffocating me. Every time I sat down, I felt something watching. Every time I stood up, I heard that wet sound behind me. I saw shapes out of the corner of my eye. They were never solid enough to track, but I felt them. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of an arm or a torso. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like a ragged breath, and I felt cold spots on my skin. It kept getting worse. The silhouettes got more elaborate. Some had their arms raised, fingers splayed like they were reaching for me. Others looked like they were halfway through a step, as if dancing or striking a pose. A few times I saw them gliding across the wall in real time. They appeared and disappeared in seconds. It wasn't just a stain anymore. It was movement. I didn't bother wiping them down every time. It felt pointless. I kept telling myself I should just leave and never come back. But my lease wasn't up and I didn't have the money to break it. So I stuck around hoping for some explanation. One night I felt so worn out that I crawled into bed and refused to open my eyes, no matter what I heard or felt. I felt cold, damp pressure against my back and a subtle tug on my hair. My heart pounded and I clenched my fists. Then I heard a low, muffled laugh. It was close to my ear, like someone was right beside me. I jumped out of bed and switched on the light. I saw nothing, but the sheets had large, wet impressions again. It looked like someone had been lying behind me, wrapping an arm around my waist. I realized I was dealing with something stuck between worlds. I didn't need a priest or an exorcist. I needed a way to force it out of my space. I couldn't think clearly, though. I had no clue how to handle something like this. All I could do was survive each day, wipe down whatever I could, and hope it would stop on its own. The next day I tried burning some strong-smelling incense I got from a local shop. I figured the smoke might do something. I walked around the apartment, letting the smoke fill the rooms. At first I thought I heard scraping sounds on the walls. Then, in the living room, I saw a group of outlines forming a half circle. They were bigger than before. Some were reaching forward, others bending low. I held the incense up, and my hand shook. There was a weird tension in the air, like static electricity. My ears rang and my skin prickled. I backed away and opened the windows, letting the smoke out. The silhouettes stayed. That night I called my friend again and told him the truth as plainly as I could. I said there was something in my apartment, something that left wet outlines and tried to touch me. He asked if I was sure I was okay. I said no. He offered to let me crash at his place until I figured things out. I'm packing up as much as I can right now. I'm looking around and I see them on every wall, some on the floor, a few on the ceiling. They shift positions every time I glance away. I'm not looking for help anymore. I just need to get out. My body feels tense and my stomach is in knots. My heart beats so hard it hurts. I can't handle sleeping here another night. I have the sense that if I stay, these figures will start touching me more and more, and maybe I won't be able to fight it off next time. I don't care if I have to pay rent on a place I won't use. I have no choice. I'm leaving this place tonight, and I'm not coming back alone. If I do come back, I'm bringing people who know what they're doing. Right now, I'm standing by my front door with my duffel bag. I feel that damp, cold presence all around me. My arms are shaking and I feel lightheaded. I keep hearing wet footsteps behind me. The wall near me has 3 separate outlines, all facing me. I can see them glistening under the overhead light. The apartment is full of these shapes, and I sense them watching. I'm done. I'm walking out. I'm locking the door, and I'm not stepping back in here by myself. I don't know what this thing is, but it doesn't belong in my life. I just hope it can't follow me. I walked onto that property for the first time on a windy afternoon. The sky was bright and the sun felt hot on my neck. A lawyer had called me 3 days earlier saying I'd inherited a remote place from a great uncle I barely remembered. When I pulled up to the long gravel driveway, I saw a cluster of stone statues around the front yard. Each statue looked like a person frozen mid-scream or mid-shudder. Their faces had deep grooves, as if someone had chiseled every line of tension into the stone. I remember feeling a tightness in my chest the moment I got out of my car. I glanced around hoping to see something normal, maybe a bird or a cat. I didn't see anything alive near the house. There was only the soft sound of leaves scraping against each other in the wind. I grabbed my suitcase from the trunk and looked at the statues more closely. They were life-sized and spaced a few feet apart. Their arms sometimes reached up, sometimes crossed over their torsos, and in some cases they pointed at nothing. I heard a faint rustle behind me, but when I turned, it was just a branch dropping from a nearby tree. My heart pounded a bit harder than usual. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. I walked up the porch steps and tried the key the lawyer sent me. The lock stuck for a second, but it opened on my second attempt and the door let out a long creak. Inside, the air felt stale, like no one had opened the windows in months. The entrance led into a narrow hallway with old wallpaper that peeled at the edges. At the end of the hallway there was a living room with a worn rug and a few pieces of heavy furniture. A layer of dust coated every surface. I set my suitcase down by the couch and walked through the house, opening windows to get some fresh air. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and each sound made my heart jump. I felt like someone was watching from behind every corner, but each time I turned around I only saw empty hallways and dusty walls. I found the kitchen in the back. It was small and had outdated appliances. A single window faced the garden, where more statues stood in a haphazard row. They were all turned toward the back of the house, as if they'd been placed there to stare inside. I couldn't see their expressions clearly from that angle, but I didn't like the idea of them looking at me while I cooked. I thought about grabbing a sheet or something to cover the window, but it was broad daylight and I felt silly letting these stone figures intimidate me. The first night I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the one with a clean mattress. I kept the door locked even though it felt unnecessary. The house was mine, but it still felt unfamiliar. The wind outside picked up and tree branches tapped against the windows. I couldn't sleep right away. My mind kept drifting to those statues. I wondered who had placed them there. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours before I finally dozed off. When I woke up around 3 a.m., I heard a soft shuffling noise from outside. At first I thought it might be an animal in the bushes, but then I realized it sounded more like gravel crunching. I forced myself to sit up and look out the window. The garden lay in darkness except for a faint moonlight. The statues were just silhouettes, but I noticed that one of them looked closer to the house than before. I couldn't be sure. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. My body felt stiff, and my heart thumped too fast. I stayed awake until dawn. listening to every little creak and whisper of wind. In the morning, I went outside to check the statues. I walked through the garden, stepping over weeds and loose stones. Each sculpture towered in front of me, about the size of an adult. Their eyes were empty holes or shallow indentations. I realized I could see more detail in the daylight. Some of them had cracks around the shoulders or at the base. But I swear the one nearest to the back entrance was about 2 feet closer to the house than I remembered from yesterday. I didn't have any proof, but the footprints in the dirt looked fresh. There were odd marks, like something heavy had dragged across the ground. I touched one statue's arm. It felt cold, coarse and unmoving, just normal stone. My skin prickled anyway. I stepped back, looked around to make sure I was alone, and headed back inside. I found the documents my great-uncle left in a small office on the ground floor. The room smelled of mold, and the shelves were cluttered with old folders and yellowed papers. After sifting through a dozen stacks, I came across a thick binder labeled "Property Records" in shaky handwriting. Inside, I discovered references to the chakra's history. The notes were a mix of official deeds and personal entries. One page described how previous owners collected these stone figures and placed them throughout the property. Another entry, written in a different pen, mentioned rumors that the statues had once been real people. The handwriting was difficult to read, but I made out words like echo, conscious, and trapped. I felt a chill run down my back as I read this. My mouth went dry and my hands started to sweat. I shut the binder and shoved it aside. I had no intention of scaring myself with old legends. The rest of that day, I tried to tidy up the house. I vacuumed a few rooms and wiped the dust off the kitchen counter. Every so often, I glanced out the windows. The statues didn't move while I watched, but I never felt at ease. The wind outside created a low moaning sound when it passed through gaps in the shutters. I jumped at every scrape of a branch or groan of a floorboard. That second night, I decided to stay up late in the living room. I turned on a lamp, set it on an end table, and positioned myself near a window that overlooked the front yard. I wanted to see if anything moved. Around midnight, the wind died down, and the air went unnaturally still. I heard a faint whisper, like someone breathing near my ear. I jerked my head around, but no one was there. My arms and legs tensed up, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The lamp flickered once, then stayed on. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of a silhouette shifting in the garden. It was one of the statues, definitely in a different spot than it was during the day. It looked like it had turned toward the house, and its arms were lifted higher. I couldn't figure out how that happened. My rational mind said there had to be a trick here, some movement of shadows. But my gut told me something else. I felt lightheaded. My palms were slick with sweat. I wanted to go to bed, but I stayed put, breathing fast, refusing to blink for long periods. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I must have dozed off on the couch. When I opened my eyes, the lamp was off, and the moonlight shone into the room. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I heard slow scraping along the front porch. I pulled myself up, my legs shaking, and looked out the window. 2 statues stood right at the edge of the porch, facing the front door. I pulled back, trying not to scream. My throat felt tight and I couldn't form words. I quietly moved away from the window and tried to think. The door was locked, but that didn't feel like much comfort. My mind raced. I grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs to my bedroom. I locked myself in and sat against the door for the rest of the night. By morning, my back hurt and my eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. I forced myself to go outside and check again. The statues were back out in the yard, arranged the way they'd been on my first day here. I circled the property, searching for footprints or drag marks. I found a few strange trails in the dirt and some scuffed patches of grass. It looked like something heavy had indeed moved. I looked at the statues' faces again, taking in each tortured expression. My stomach twisted, and I felt a wave of nausea. It made no sense, but the evidence was right there. These figures weren't staying put. I remembered the documents I had found, the ones mentioning echoes. I went back to the office. I wanted more details, but I felt a knot in my throat as I read through the pages. One note mentioned that the reflections of people who spent too much time on the property could get absorbed. It warned that if a person saw their own reflection near a statue at exactly the wrong time, they might vanish. I slammed the binder shut when I read that. My chest tightened and sweat trickled down my temples. I kept telling myself it was some old absurd legend. Over the next few days, I started noticing more unsettling things. Sometimes when I walked by a mirror or a window, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. Other times I heard faint muttering late at night, like multiple voices speaking in low, urgent tones. I never understood any words. The fear in my stomach felt like a constant knot. I paced around the house, double-checking locks and peering out windows. The statues seemed to come closer every night, then return to their original positions by sunrise. One evening, while pacing in the hallway, I knocked over a dusty mirror. It cracked on one side but didn't shatter completely. I caught a brief glimpse of my own reflection. It looked pale, exhausted, and wide-eyed. I felt my heart skip a beat when I thought I saw another shape behind me. I turned around quickly. Nothing was there, but the hair on my arms stood up. I dragged that mirror into the office and covered it with an old sheet. I didn't want to risk seeing anything else. A few nights after that, I woke to a scraping sound against the window next to my bed. My body tensed. I reached for a flashlight on the nightstand and slowly got up. My hand shook as I pulled back the curtain an inch. A statue's face was pressed close to the glass, as if it was peering in. Its stone eyes looked hollow, but the mouth seemed to open wider than before. I let the curtain drop and stumbled back. My heart pounded so hard that I thought it might burst. I stood there breathing fast. I didn't know what to do. If I walked outside, I'd face these statues up close, but staying inside didn't feel any safer. I rushed downstairs and grabbed the binder again. I found a paragraph that described a ritual used by a previous owner. It talked about placing large sheets around the statues to block their line of sight. The text claimed that if the statues lost any visual link to a person, they stopped moving for a while. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might buy time. That was all I needed. I found old tarps in the shed behind the house, along with rope and some stakes. Around noon the next day, I walked into the garden, stepping carefully between statues and draped tarps over the ones closest to the house. Their outlines were still visible, but I couldn't see those anguished faces or twisted postures. I tied the tarps down as best I could, ignoring the queasy feeling in my stomach. The air felt heavy and warm. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and I wiped it away with a rag. I stayed out there for almost an hour, covering as many statues as I could. I half expected them to move right in front of me, but they stayed still. That night I slept lightly. Every little noise set me on edge. I heard shifting somewhere outside, a kind of low drag across the porch. I gripped my bedsheet in my fists, heart hammering, and waited for the next sound. Minutes passed, and I heard nothing else. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. The tarps had probably stopped them. I drifted off, but my dreams were filled with images of stone hands grabbing at me. In the early morning, I found that the tarps were mostly torn off. Pieces of fabric lay scattered across the lawn. The statues stood exactly where I'd left them, but now they were uncovered. Their faces were the same as before, though I sensed a slight change in their posture. One figure near the porch looked like it was leaning forward more than it had been. I swallowed hard and took a step back. I dropped the scraps of tarp and hurried inside. I knew I couldn't live like this. I needed a better plan. I moved through the house, packing my car with the few belongings I had. I decided to grab any important records and lock up the place. But when I went to the office, I saw something strange on the floor. The mirror I'd covered with a sheet had slid halfway out. The sheet was bunched up, and I could see my own face in the cracked glass. My reflection flickered in the uneven surface, and for a split second, I noticed a faint distortion, like a statue's face superimposed over mine. I gasped and stumbled backward. I slammed the office door shut. I left the house without looking back. As I approached my car, I felt dozens of eyes on me. I glanced once toward the garden and saw the statues lined up, turned in my direction. My hands shook as I opened the car door. My breathing was fast. I felt an urge to look at myself in the rearview mirror, but I stopped. I adjusted the mirror downward so I wouldn't see my face at all. Then I started the engine and drove away. I plan to come back with professionals. Maybe a team that specializes in weird artifacts or something like that. I'm not sure what they'll find or what they'll do. But for now, I refuse to stay. As I drove off that day, I couldn't shake the idea that those statues stored conscious echoes of real people. The documents hinted at it, the movements suggested it, and I felt it in my gut. I don't want to become the next figure in that stone garden. I won't let my reflection vanish inside those cold eyes. So this is where I am. I haven't returned yet. The property is still mine, but I don't know how long I can keep it without losing my mind. Every night, I lie awake in my city apartment, wondering if the statues are creeping across the yard in my absence, waiting for me to come back. I won't sleep well until I figure out a permanent solution, but I also won't step foot there alone again. That's all I can tell you. There's no neat ending or final explanation. Those statues are still there and I can't say what they want. All I know is, I'm not letting them catch me. I've seen enough to know I won't risk my own reflection on that property again. That's the truth. It's not pretty. It's not wrapped up in a bow, but it's real, and it's mine to deal with. I first spotted that old train station on a rainy night. The place sat on the outskirts of town, near a stretch of abandoned industrial warehouses. The parking lot was cracked, and weeds grew through every gap in the concrete. Faded signs pointed in different directions, but I only noticed the tall structure of the station looming in the distance. I wasn't sure why I felt pulled to it, but I parked my car and walked across the broken asphalt anyway. The wind whipped around, carrying a stale smell of metal and damp earth. I saw no lights, no movement, nothing that hinted at any active use of the station. I expected it to be completely empty. Turns out I was wrong. I'm not usually the type of person who investigates strange places at night, but I couldn't help myself. The front door to the main building was halfway open, creaking on its old hinges. I stepped inside and saw a dim corridor lined with shattered tiles and a few broken benches. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti. My footsteps echoed, and the sound gave me a weird chill. I remember thinking the place felt like it had been frozen in time. No sign of workers, travelers, or security. Just me, standing there in the dark, listening to my own breathing. I walked down the hallway and saw the old ticket counters in the distance. There were bits of paper and trash everywhere. The overhead lights were either dead or flickering. I heard dripping water somewhere close. I kept going until I reached a wide waiting area that once held rows of seats. Now, most were torn apart or missing. My heart thumped harder when I noticed a single door leading to the back of the station near the tracks. It was a thick metal door with scratched paint. I pushed it open, and it let out a metallic squeal. On the other side, a narrow ramp led down to the train platforms. At first, I thought everything would be empty, but one track still had a single train car attached to it. The rest of the train was gone, leaving only this single cabin. Its windows were cloudy, like nobody had cleaned them in years. I walked closer, trying to see if there was any sign of life. I didn't see lights inside, and I didn't hear any motors running. It stood there like a huge, dead shell of metal. I've always been curious about old trains. I grew up seeing them in pictures, but I never had a chance to explore one up close. This felt like my opportunity, even though it was the middle of the night in a place that made me uneasy. My gut told me to turn around. My brain told me I could handle a quick look. So I climbed the short set of steps at the side of the car. The door was unlocked. I slid it open and stepped in. The inside smelled like mildew and dust. My eyes took a moment to adjust. I could see rows of seats with stained cushions. The overhead luggage racks were empty, but a few pieces of trash and papers were scattered on the floor. I noticed broken light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. The air felt stale. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dirt. I took a few steps down the aisle, stepping over a crumpled soda can and a torn brochure. I touched one of the seats. It felt damp and cold. I was about halfway through the car when I heard a faint noise. It sounded like radio static or muffled voices. At first, I thought it came from outside, maybe from the wind, but it persisted. I listened harder, and it seemed to come from the broken overhead speakers. They were full of cracks and dark stains, but I could swear I heard a faint sound, like an announcement in an echoing station. I froze and waited for it to stop, but it repeated, crackling and cutting out. I couldn't make out words. It just sounded like a long, drawn-out whisper, followed by something that might have been a station name I didn't recognize. My heartbeat sped up. There was nobody else in that car with me. I was sure of it. The doors had all been locked or jammed. The windows were fogged and dusty. I wanted to tell myself the sound was just an old recording stuck on a loop. Maybe it was a glitch. But my nerves were on edge, so I decided to backtrack and head out. As I turned, a flicker of light shot through one of the overhead bulbs. It was just a flash, then darkness again. That was enough to make me hurry to the door. I pulled on the handle, ready to leave, but it jammed. It wouldn't budge, like someone had sealed it from the outside. My throat tightened and my palms got sweaty. I tried again, using my shoulder to push. Still, nothing. I walked back up the aisle, searching for another exit. The only other door was at the far end. I approached it carefully, shining my phone's flashlight in front of me. As soon as I reached the door, I heard a loud screech from the speakers above me. It made my ears ring. I crouched down, clamping my hands over my head. The screech disappeared, replaced by faint murmuring that sounded like people talking. I couldn't make out the words, but it definitely sounded like a group. Then it cut off. Dead silence again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. I grabbed the handle of the second door. It opened about an inch, then slammed shut as if pulled by an invisible force. My hands were shaking, so I tried again, but it wouldn't give. By now, my shirt was soaked with sweat. The car felt hotter, or maybe I was just panicking. I stood in the aisle, swallowing hard, trying to think. The windows looked fragile, so I moved to one of them, intending to slide it open or break it if needed. I grabbed the latch, but it was rusted in place. No matter how I pulled, it wouldn't move. I tapped the glass with my phone, and it sounded thick, stronger than normal window panes. Something bumped the back of my shoulder. I spun around, shining my phone's light behind me. No one was there. The seat backs lined up in neat rows. Nothing moved. I tried to calm down by taking slow breaths, but my mouth felt dry and I kept swallowing. I decided to walk up and down the aisle, searching each row of seats for something I could use as a tool or a weapon. I found an old metal pipe under a seat near the center. It looked corroded, but solid enough to smash a window if I put enough force into it. I walked to the nearest window and swung the pipe. The glass vibrated, but didn't break. I hit it again. It cracked slightly, but then I heard a weird humming from the ceiling. The lights flickered. The floor trembled beneath my feet like the car was moving on the track. My stomach lurched, and I staggered, grabbing a seat for balance. I peered outside, wiping a bit of grime off the window with my sleeve. The night outside looked strange. The lights from the station had shifted in position, as if we were pulling out of the platform. But that was impossible. The station was abandoned, and this car was alone. The vibrations intensified. The screeching overhead resumed. Then I heard a distorted voice. It said something like, "Next station," followed by static. I couldn't tell what station name it announced. My hands shook around the pipe, and I felt a wave of nausea. The entire train car lurched forward, and I stumbled into the wall. My phone dropped from my hand, clattering to the floor. When I picked it up, I noticed the time hadn't changed from when I first entered the station. The screen still read the same minute and hour, which sent a fresh jolt of fear through my chest. I looked around for an emergency exit or a lever to stop whatever was happening. I saw an old emergency brake handle near the door at the back of the car. I moved toward it, but the overhead lights flashed and a shadow crossed the aisle. It happened so fast that I only caught a glimpse of a shape. It looked like a person. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped toward the aisle, shining my phone's flashlight into the seats. There was nothing there, but I was sure I'd seen something move. I kept going toward the handle. My steps were shaky, and the rocking of the car made it hard to walk straight. I grabbed the handle and yanked down. It didn't move. I pulled harder, but it felt locked in place. Frustration built in my chest, and I tried once more with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the overhead lights blinked, and the corridor filled with a loud thumping noise. It sounded like heavy footsteps running through the aisle, but I couldn't see anyone. I turned in circles, pointing my phone in every direction. Nothing showed up in the beam of light, yet I felt the weight of each footstep vibrating through the floor. I started shouting, demanding to know who was there. Nobody answered. The thumping got louder, then stopped abruptly. My own breaths felt ragged and shallow. I forced myself to move forward, searching for another exit or maybe a hatch in the floor. The seats were all bolted down, but I spotted a narrow door near the corner, possibly leading to some electrical panel. I tried it, but it was locked. I banged the pipe against it and the door dented slightly, but it didn't break open. My senses felt overloaded. The entire car swayed and the windows rattled. The overhead speakers crackled again, announcing stations with muffled voices I couldn't understand. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My temples ached. A strong smell of burning wires seeped in, and I saw smoke drifting from one of the broken light fixtures. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face to clear the air. My eyes watered, but I refused to stop. I had to keep looking for a way out. I reached the front of the car, near the operator's booth. The door to the booth was closed. I twisted the knob, and to my relief, it opened. Inside, I found a small panel with various dials and switches. The windshield at the front was so dirty I could barely see outside. I wiped a spot with my sleeve and saw darkness rushing by. It felt like the train was speeding through a tunnel. My head spun. I knew we couldn't be in a tunnel. The station was near open fields, but the view through the window showed walls on each side as if we were underground. I ran my fingers across the controls. Most were rusted. A couple of switches moved when I touched them, but nothing happened. There was a small lever labeled power, so I tried pushing it down. The train's lights flickered and the static from the speakers grew louder. I moved it back up and the flickering stopped. My heart was pounding against my ribcage. My stomach felt hollow. I wanted to find a brake or something similar. I only saw an unlabeled red switch near the bottom of the panel. I flipped it, and a loud hiss came from under the floor. The car jolted, and for a second, I thought it might come to a stop. Then it lurched again, throwing me against the operator's chair. I crawled back out into the aisle. My knees felt weak, and I used one of the seat backs to pull myself up. The overhead lights had dimmed, giving everything a dirty yellow glow. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision. I kept hearing those muffled voices through the speakers. I held the pipe tightly, moving toward the rear of the car again. My goal was to try the emergency door once more. Maybe it had unlocked. As I inched down the aisle, I noticed movement in the seats. I raised my phone's light. A figure sat there, facing away from me. It wore dark clothing, but I couldn't see the face. My throat went dry, and I almost dropped the pipe. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. I stepped closer, sweat rolling down my back. I tried to see if it was an actual person or a shadow. My phone's light illuminated part of the seat, but the figure was gone. The seat was empty. It felt like my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was sure I had seen something there. I hurried to the rear door. I put my hand on the handle. It turned, and the door opened. My chest flooded with relief. I stepped through and found myself in a small space that connected to the next car, but there was no next car. Outside, I saw absolute darkness. No track, no platform, no lights. Just a void. The wind whipped through, cold and sharp. The train was definitely moving. I shut the door, not wanting to fall into that emptiness. When I turned around to go back into the car, the door behind me slammed shut and locked from the inside. I rattled the handle, cursing under my breath, but it wouldn't open again. I felt stuck in that small space with the wind howling through the crack at the edge of the door leading outside. My heart pounded, and my mouth tasted bitter. I had to make a decision. Either stand there, waiting for something else to happen, or move back in. Suddenly, the lights inside the car blinked off. I was left with the glow from my phone. I could barely see past the window in the door. The overhead speakers crackled again, and I heard another announcement. It sounded like a final stop. My gut twisted, and my breathing sped up. If this was the final stop, I wanted off. I just needed to find a safe way out without jumping into the darkness. I banged on the door, demanding that it open. I used the metal pipe to pry at the edges. Finally, the latch clicked, and I managed to push it open. I stumbled back into the main car. The seats were now illuminated by a faint green glow from the emergency lights that had switched on. I noticed something odd. The seats were no longer covered in dust. They looked cleaner, as if the train had been in use. My head spun. I walked down the aisle again, checking each row. No shadows, no figures. Then the car lurched one final time and became still. Everything stopped. The vibration, the flickering lights, even the static overhead. I went to the door I originally tried to leave through. I pulled it, and this time it swung open without resistance. I stepped outside onto a platform that looked partially collapsed. The air felt cold. My hands were trembling. I heard a faint screech as the train door slid shut behind me. When I turned back, the car looked battered and old again, just like when I first found it. No glow from inside, no sign of motion. It was just sitting there on the track. I glanced around. The station looked abandoned and silent. My phone screen had updated to the correct time again, hours later than when I first entered. I felt unsteady on my feet, but I managed to walk away from the train car. I glanced behind me a few times, expecting it to move or vanish, but it stayed right there, looking dead and empty. I climbed the ramp back into the main station. When I reached the exterior door, I was surprised it wasn't jammed. It opened easily. Outside, the rain had stopped. The lot was just as broken and dark as when I first got there, but at least I felt safer. I rushed to my car, started the engine, and left. My hands were still shaking as I drove onto the empty road. I kept looking in the rear-view mirror, worried I might see headlights from a phantom train behind me. But there was nothing except darkness and wet pavement. Once I got home, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I still have no explanation. The station remains there, locked in its ruin, and that train car is probably still on that track. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in my head, but I felt every bump, heard every echo, and saw every flicker. I've told a few people about it, but they shrug it off. I haven't gone back. I have no desire to see if that train would take me somewhere else again. I'm done with that place. I have enough nightmares. And whenever I hear the faint crackle of static or the sound of distant tracks, I freeze up and remember that long night inside a single haunted train car that seemed determined to move on its own route. I'm not going near it again. I walked into that old office on a Monday morning. The real estate company I work for wanted the place cleaned and ready for some inspection. The building stood on a quiet block, and the front door creaked when I pushed it open. I remember looking around and feeling something strange in the air. My arms had goosebumps, and I hadn't even started sweeping yet. The hallway smelled stale, like no one had walked through there in a long time. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the overhead lights buzzed whenever I switched them on. I decided to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach, but it never went away. I started my routine with a quick look at each room. The first office had old desks stacked in the corner. The second office had a few chairs scattered around. The third office had a big shelf against the wall, and I noticed a thick layer of dust covering the shelves and the furniture. I coughed a couple of times. The air felt heavy. I opened a window, but it didn't help much. I saw dust motes floating in the sunlight. Each small speck drifted slowly, and my eyes started burning after a few minutes in there. I remember thinking I should get a mask from my car, but I felt impatient. I just wanted to finish this job quickly. I grabbed a broom and started sweeping the hallway, then worked my way into the first office. As I moved the broom back and forth, I heard a soft vibration in the air. It wasn't a loud noise. It felt more like a low hum in the walls. I stopped sweeping for a moment and listened. The hum disappeared, so I shrugged it off and got back to work. When I swept the dust into a pile near the door, I glanced at the surface of an old wooden desk. The dust clumped together in a shape that made me pause. It looked like a face staring at me, with faint outlines where the eyes and mouth should be. My heart rate shot up for a second, but the shape fell apart when I moved closer. I told myself it was just my imagination. I moved on to the second office. There was an old sofa along the wall. The cushions were torn and dust covered the entire thing. When I swiped my hand across the top cushion, I saw a faint image in the dust again, like two eyes watching me. I froze. I stepped back and rubbed my eyes. The outline faded, and the dust scattered with my movement. My palms started sweating. I decided to open another window to let in fresh air, but the windows were stuck. I had to shove them hard to make them budge. Fresh air flowed in, and I tried to shake off the anxiety. I kept telling myself it was just random patterns in the dust. After that, I walked toward the third office, the one with the big shelf. As soon as I walked in, I felt that same vibration in the air. It seemed stronger there. The walls looked discolored near the ceiling. I set down my broom and started wiping the shelf with a rag. Each swipe sent dust floating around. As I wiped the top surface, I spotted a partial face forming in the scattered dust again. This time, it looked more detailed. I saw the curve of a forehead and part of a nose. I felt my throat tighten and I backed up a step. My breathing sped up, and my hand shook a bit. The face disappeared when the dust settled. I tried to distract myself with my phone. I wanted to take photos of the rooms before and after cleaning. That's part of the procedure sometimes, especially with older properties. I snapped a few shots in the first two offices without a problem. Then I took a picture of the shelf. On my phone screen, the image looked blurry, like the camera couldn't focus. I tried again. The second photo showed a twisted shape where the dust had been. It looked like a distorted expression of pain, maybe anger. The details on the shelf appeared wavy and the edges of the photo were dark. I felt a chill run down my spine. I checked my phone's lens and saw no dirt on it. I took more photos around the room, but every single one looked distorted in a strange way. I left that office and took a short break in the hallway. My breathing was unsteady, and I felt sweat rolling down my forehead. I leaned against a wall and tried to calm down. My heart was racing and my chest felt tight. I looked at my phone again, flipping through the images. The first office looked fine. The second office looked fine. The third office images were all messed up. I wondered if maybe the camera sensor was malfunctioning under the lighting in that room. I drank some water and decided to power through. I came back into the third office and started sweeping under the big shelf. The dust piled up in large clumps. It looked thick and heavy, like it had been building up for decades. The broom made a scraping sound on the wooden floor. At one point, I heard a soft whisper near my ear. I jumped and spun around, but there was no one there. My hand trembled, and my mouth felt dry. I stood still and listened. The room was quiet. I walked over to the window, but it was stuck like the others. I tried not to panic. As I continued cleaning, I noticed a faint tapping sound behind the shelf. It was rhythmic, like something knocking from the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, but the sound stopped. My stomach churned. I felt a headache forming. I couldn't pinpoint what was happening, but I felt a strong urge to get out of there. I checked the time on my phone. I had only been there for about 2 hours, and I still had the rest of the office to clean. I considered leaving and coming back another day, but I hated the idea of dragging this out. I moved on to the next room, which was smaller. There was a single filing cabinet and a broken computer desk. The dust on the filing cabinet door seemed to shift whenever I looked away. I thought it was a trick of the light. I wiped the cabinet with a damp cloth. The dust clung to the cloth in thick layers. My nose started itching. I sneezed a few times and my eyes teared up. As I turned to throw the cloth into a trash bag, I saw a shape on the filing cabinet door. It looked like a face again, but more pronounced this time. The eyes were narrowed and the mouth was open. It was gone in a second, but my heart thumped hard in my chest. I took out my phone and tried to film the cabinet. The video flickered and showed static lines across the screen. After a few seconds, the screen froze and my phone restarted by itself. I stood there, confused. I rubbed my forehead, feeling a slight headache. The back of my neck felt damp with sweat. I slid my phone into my pocket and finished cleaning the cabinet as fast as I could. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around noon, I decided to eat a quick lunch in the hallway. I unwrapped a sandwich and drank more water. My throat felt scratchy, and my head pounded. The entire building was silent except for the faint hum I heard earlier. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Sometimes it sounded like it was right behind me. Other times it felt like it was coming from the floor. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I finished half of my sandwich and tossed the rest in a bag. I wanted to finish the job fast and get out. I returned to the third office to clean the floor and baseboards. As I kneeled to scrub a stubborn stain near the corner, I sensed movement in the dust around me. The particles on the floor started shifting on their own, forming small shapes. I leaned closer and they formed a faint outline of a face near my knees. The eyes were slanted and the shape seemed to flicker in place. My chest felt tight and my breathing got shallow. I scrambled back, bumping into the shelf behind me. A few boxes fell off the shelf and hit the floor with a loud thud. Dust rose in a cloud and the entire room felt electrified. My ears rang for a moment. I stood, my legs shaking, and stared at the new dust cloud swirling in front of me. Several shapes formed in the cloud. I saw multiple faces. Some looked angry, others looked sad. All of them seemed to stare at me. My stomach twisted, and I felt a jolt of adrenaline in my arms. I yelled out, "Stop," without thinking, as if I could command dust to stop moving. The shapes flickered and dissolved when the dust settled. I felt a pang of relief, but my skin was clammy, and my heartbeat refused to slow down. I grabbed my phone again, determined to document what was happening. I switched to video mode and aimed at the shelf. As soon as I hit record, I heard static in my earbuds. I had them draped around my neck, not playing music at the moment. The phone's screen glitched with colorful lines. Then a sharp squeal pierced the air. It hurt my ears and I almost dropped the phone. I managed to stop recording, but my phone froze again. I pressed the power button until it rebooted. I checked my gallery, but the video file was corrupted. I couldn't think of a logical explanation for the dust-forming faces or the camera malfunctions. My shoulders felt tense, and my lower back started aching from the stress. I decided I needed to gather my equipment and finish the last few tasks quickly. I ignored the shapes in the dust as best I could. I stopped trying to take pictures or videos. I wiped the surfaces, swept the floors, and stacked a few boxes near the door. Every so often I spotted a flicker of a face in the dust, and each time my heart lurched. My pulse throbbed in my neck. I felt cornered in a place that didn't want me there. I heard another whisper behind me as I emptied a trash bin. The voice sounded like it was breathing right into my ear. I spun around, clutching the bin, but the office was empty. A chill shot across my arms. My teeth clenched, and I muttered, "I'm almost done. That's it." I forced myself to keep moving. The air felt thicker with every passing minute. The faint hum grew louder, and I occasionally caught a soft sigh echoing in the corners. Each time, the hair on my arm stood on end. At one point, I realized I had only one room left to check, a small storage closet in the back. I walked in and flicked on the light. The bulb flickered overhead. The closet smelled musty. There were old shelves covered in dust, a few broken chairs, and some sealed boxes. I started sweeping the floor. The dust formed a small pile, but I kept my eyes on it, worried I'd see another face. I did. It appeared near the top of the dust pile, a quick flicker of a mouth twisted in anger. My breathing got shallow, and I slammed the broom handle down. The shape scattered. Suddenly, the overhead bulb went out, leaving me in near darkness. I stumbled forward and nearly tripped over a box. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. When I turned it on, I saw dust swirling in the beam. I moved the light around and the dust drifted slowly to the floor. I felt dizzy, like the air was pressing in on me. I hurried out of the closet. My shirt was damp with sweat. My legs felt weak. The hum in the wall sounded louder in that narrow space. It vibrated through my bones. I returned to the hallway and slumped against the wall. My breaths were shallow, and my mouth tasted bitter from the stress. I told myself I had done enough cleaning. The important areas were handled. I gathered my supplies, shoved them into a bag, and headed for the exit. As I reached the front door, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The corridor stretched out behind me, dimly lit. I saw a small swirl of dust near the far end, and it looked like a partial face. I heard a quiet sigh echo through the hallway. My entire body tensed, and I rushed outside. Once I was outside, the sun felt harsh on my eyes. The wind hit my face, and I took a moment to breathe. My hands were shaking and my heart pounded in my chest. I locked the front door and stepped back to look at the building. From the street, it just looked like an old, empty office. There was no sign of anything unusual. The windows were grimy, and the paint on the facade was chipped. Nothing about it suggested strange dust shapes or distorted images. I felt sweat dripping down my temples. I rubbed my palms on my pants, trying to calm down. I got in my car and cranked the AC. My phone finally worked normally outside. I glanced at the photos again. The ones from the first two offices still looked fine. The ones from the third office showed those warped shapes and angry expressions. No matter how many times I looked, I couldn't explain them. I felt a sense of relief being away from that place, but I also felt a lingering tension in my gut. Something in that old office felt awake, like it didn't want anyone disturbing it. I realized I didn't care about a logical explanation anymore. I just wanted to stay away from that building. My entire body was sore, and my eyes burned. On the drive back, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I half expected to see faces forming in the dust on my dashboard, but the car stayed normal. My breathing eventually steadied, but my muscles remained tense the whole ride. When I got home, I left my cleaning supplies in the trunk and went straight for a shower, hoping the hot water would wash away that feeling of being watched. I stared at the bathroom tiles and replayed everything in my mind. I decided I would talk to my boss the next morning and maybe get someone else to handle any remaining cleaning tasks. I never went back to that old office. I finished my report, turned over the keys, and told my boss that place was ready for inspection. I didn't tell him about the faces or the weird camera distortions. I just said it was dusty and the lighting was poor. I didn't want any questions. Sometimes I look at those photos on my phone and wonder what was really happening in there. I still can't figure it out, but I remember the feeling of that dust shifting on its own. I remember the whispers, the tapping inside the walls, the low hum in the air, and the strange shapes that appeared every time I tried to clean. I can't shake the thought that there was something in that building, something old and restless, and that my cleaning disturbed it. But I don't plan on going back to find out. I still remember the first time I saw those shapes on the shower curtain. I was in a hurry that morning, trying to get ready for work in my new apartment, and I noticed these strange, abstract lines scattered across the plastic. At first, I didn't think much of it. It looked like something a bored person might draw with a permanent marker, random swirls with no purpose. But something about those markings stayed in my head. I felt a slight shiver when I passed by them to grab my towel. I didn't know why. I told myself it was just a draft from the window. I had moved into this small apartment the day before. It was all I could afford after I changed jobs and had to relocate. The landlord gave me the key, walked me up the creaky stairs, and pointed to a few spots on the walls where the paint was chipping. He said he planned to fix them eventually, but he never mentioned anything about the bathroom. There was a strange look on his face when I asked if the place had been vacant for long, but he just shrugged and said, "Not many people stuck around." I didn't pry. I was happy to have a roof over my head. That first night, I was too tired to notice anything unusual. I unpacked some clothes, ate takeout on the floor, and passed out on my futon. The next morning, I took a quick shower. That's when the drawings on the curtain first caught my eye. The curtain was already there when I moved in. It looked cheap, slightly yellowed around the edges. But I didn't pay much attention. I needed to get clean and get going. I left the apartment around 8, thinking about nothing but my new job. That evening, I came home with a few groceries and some cleaning supplies. I decided to scrub the bathroom because the entire place felt grimy, and the smell near the tub was a little off. It wasn't rotten, but there was a stale odor like old mop water. I took the shower curtain down. I carried it into the hallway because I wanted to see if it was worth cleaning or if I should just toss it and buy another one. The abstract drawings were all over the plastic, front and back. Some lines were thick and spiraled into clusters. Others were thin and jagged. When I moved the curtain under the light, I thought I saw faint shapes hidden behind the bigger lines. It reminded me of scratch marks. I felt unsettled, but I shrugged it off and decided it wasn't worth the hassle. I put the curtain in a plastic bag and tossed it in the dumpster out back. The next morning, I woke up to a chill in the apartment. I walked into the bathroom and there it was again, the same curtain hanging from the rod. I stopped in the doorway, confused. I stood there, squinting. I knew I had thrown that thing away. I lifted a corner and checked the design. The lines and clusters were identical. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was half asleep. I checked the shower rod. It wasn't new. It had the same old rings, some of them rusted. I pulled the curtain down and inspected it. There was a small stain on the lower right corner that I recognized. It was definitely the same piece of plastic. My heart started beating faster. I shook my head and tried to come up with a simple explanation. Maybe I threw out the wrong curtain. Maybe the landlord replaced it with one that looked the same. I wasn't sure. I felt uneasy, but I told myself I was just overreacting. I decided to go buy a brand new curtain. I drove to a nearby store that afternoon, bought a plain white one, and brought it back. I removed the old curtain again, rolled it up, and threw it in the dumpster. I hung the new one, then double-checked the door was locked. I didn't want anyone sneaking in to switch curtains for some weird prank. That night I was restless. I heard odd creaking sounds in the apartment, which I assumed came from the pipes or the old floorboards. Around 2 in the morning I felt a draft, so I got up to close the bathroom window. I flipped on the light. The old curtain was back. My new white curtain was gone. I stood there staring at it. A chill spread from my spine to my arms. My mouth went dry, and my heart pounded. I yanked the shower curtain down. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do with it, so I stuffed it in the cabinet under the sink. The next day, I decided to get to the bottom of this. I called the landlord and asked him if he'd been in my unit. He sounded half asleep, said no, and mumbled something about previous tenants. He said some people like to talk about weird things that happened, but he never believed them. I asked what he meant, and he said, "It's nothing. Old rumors, that's all." I pressed him for details, and he hung up. I spent the next hour pacing around my living room. Finally, I went down to the basement where there were some old storage rooms. I thought maybe I'd find some leftover junk from the previous tenant that could explain all this. I found boxes of old newspapers, a few old chairs, and some dusty lamps. No sign of anything that looked connected to my shower curtain. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the problem. I used the new curtain I'd bought, but whenever I showered, I felt uneasy. I noticed odd shadows on the walls. I noticed the temperature in the bathroom felt colder than the rest of the apartment. One night, I saw a flicker of movement through the steam. I jerked around. Nothing was there. I stepped out of the tub and I saw water drops forming patterns on the tiles. I wiped them away, but they kept forming. My skin felt clammy, and I kept glancing at the cabinet under the sink. I knew that old curtain was still in there. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep again. Around midnight, I decided to grab the old curtain and check it carefully. I wanted to see if there was a name or a signature. I turned on every light in my living room and spread the curtain on the floor. I got down on my knees and ran my fingertips along the surface. The lines were slightly raised. Then I noticed something new. When I breathed on it, Sections of the design became clearer. I leaned in and breathed softly. Different lines appeared, forming shapes. I did it again, and I swear they looked like faces. They weren't friendly. Their eyes were empty, and their mouths were wide, like they were screaming in silence. My body tensed up. A surge of panic kicked in. I folded the curtain fast and shoved it back under the sink. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. My arms felt heavy, and my head pounded. I stumbled into the bathroom to splash water on my face. The air was cold. I turned the hot water on, letting the sink fill. That's when I noticed the new curtain was gone again. Instead, the old curtain was back on the rod. Steam rose from the sink, and I saw the lines shift on the plastic like they were alive. I backed out, turned off the faucet, and closed the bathroom door. I took a few deep breaths and opened the door again. The lines were still there, but they weren't moving. I felt lightheaded. I needed fresh air, so I grabbed my coat and left for a walk. I ended up at a local cafe. While sipping coffee, I looked up any history about the apartment building. I found a few references on a local forum. One person mentioned a tenant who used to talk about washing spirits away in that building. Another person claimed they heard weird sounds in the pipes whenever they turned the hot water on. I scrolled through old posts until I came across a rumor that someone had practiced spiritual washings in the exact apartment I was renting. There weren't any graphic details, just talk of rituals in the bathroom. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. My stomach felt tight. I realized I had to figure out a way to get rid of that curtain for good. I went back home with a plan. I wrapped the curtain in thick plastic, taped it up, and stuffed it in a large trash bag. I took that bag outside, walked a few blocks, and threw it in a public dumpster near some stores. I made sure it was buried under other trash. Then I went back to my apartment and locked the door. That night, I tried to calm myself by watching TV and avoiding the bathroom. When I finally went to bed, I left the lights on in the hallway. The next morning, I took a step into the bathroom. My heart skipped a beat. The curtain was back again, hanging from the same hooks. This time, though, I noticed something else. The faces were clearer. They had more detail around the eyes and mouths. I saw deep lines on their foreheads. The eyes looked hollow, and the mouths looked twisted like they were trying to form words. I walked closer slowly. My hands were clammy. The faces seemed to shift when I moved. I leaned in, and I swear one face turned slightly toward me, as though it was following me with its hollow gaze. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet tile. My heart pounded and my legs trembled. I had to find a different approach. I grabbed my phone and searched for local experts, maybe someone who knew about weird items or hauntings. I found a name mentioned in a thread about spiritual cleansing. It was an older man who lived a few miles away. I called him, but nobody answered. I kept trying until he finally picked up. He sounded annoyed, but listened to my problem. He told me I should leave the apartment if I was smart. When I insisted, he told me I'd need to finish what was started. I pressed him to explain, but he just said those faces were stuck, still needing release. He said I might have to confront them directly with hot water and steam. I didn't like that idea at all, but I had no other plan. That night, I turned on the hot shower. The bathroom filled with steam. I felt my pulse quicken. My skin felt sweaty, and my shirt stuck to my back. The curtain started to move like a gentle breeze was blowing through, even though the window was closed. I saw the faces appear in the clouds of steam. They looked more solid than before. Their mouths seemed to open wider. The lines looked like twisted veins running through each face. They pressed closer to me. I could almost see the outline of shoulders and arms. I backed up against the wall. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as I struggled to breathe. In a shaky voice, I demanded they leave. I repeated that I wasn't their captor, that I had nothing to do with their binding. I could feel the heat stinging my skin, and sweat dripped down my temples. The faces kept forming. One of them, a wide-eyed shape with sunken cheeks, pushed out so far it almost touched my shoulder. I flinched and raised my arm, but it just lingered there, silent. My eyes burned from the humidity and fear, but I kept talking, telling them I was letting them go. I pulled the curtain open, letting more steam escape. The shapes flickered. I heard a low, faint sound in my ears, like a moan. My eyes darted around, looking for the source. I felt my heart racing so fast I thought I would pass out. I stuck my arm through the steam and grabbed the curtain with both hands. The plastic felt cold, despite the heat. My arms shook as I ripped it off the hooks. I stepped out of the bathroom, the hot water still running behind me. I wrestled with the curtain, pressing it to the floor. I tried not to look at the faces. My body trembled, and my heart pounded. It felt like I was fighting a live thing, but I kept a tight grip. Then I dragged it back into the bathroom, letting the hot steam wash over it. The lines seemed to swirl. The faces flickered in and out. I heard more of that low moan. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to keep going. I repeated I was letting them go, telling them to leave through the steam. My hands felt numb and my legs shook. After a few minutes of standing there in the heat, I felt the plastic grow still. The lines stopped moving. The moaning faded away. I turned off the water, breathing hard. I held the curtain up and the shapes looked dull. The faces weren't as defined. I carried it outside, my clothes soaked with sweat and water. I walked to the backyard, found a metal garbage can, and placed the curtain inside. I lit a match and held it against the edge of the plastic. It melted slowly. A foul smell drifted up, and I almost gagged. I kept going until the entire curtain was reduced to a lump of half-melted plastic. The smoke burned my eyes. I coughed and spat. Finally, I doused it with water from a garden hose. The lumps hardened. I stood there in the cold air for a long moment, just breathing. My clothes were soaked and my arms felt heavy. I looked around expecting something to leap out of the shadows, but nothing happened. It was quiet. I left the melted plastic in the can and went back upstairs. I cleaned up the bathroom, wiped off the floor, and opened the window. The stench of hot plastic still clung to me, so I took a quick shower behind an empty rod. The next morning, I bought another new curtain. This time, it stayed where it should. After that, the apartment felt different. The bathroom no longer seemed cold. The stale smell was gone, and the lines on the walls looked normal. I slept through the night for the first time in ages. No more strange shadows, no more moaning. I still think about those faces sometimes. I wonder if they ever left or if they simply dissolved along with the plastic. But I try not to dwell on it. I threw out that can a few days later and never looked inside again. The landlord never asked me about anything. I kept living there until my lease was up, and then I moved on. I never saw that old curtain again. I moved into this place because it had a built-in studio in the basement. The listing showed photos of weird old instruments lining the walls. I'd never seen a property quite like it before. I felt this pull to check it out in person. I needed extra space for my amateur recordings. It seemed perfect. The house itself looked normal from the outside. 2 stories, chipped paint, and a small yard with untrimmed bushes. But the real highlight was the studio in the basement. I didn't pay attention to the faint smell of damp wood or the flicker of the overhead lights. I was too excited about the equipment. Once I stepped inside the studio, I realized the photos hadn't captured everything. There were instruments I couldn't even name. Some looked like old string instruments from distant countries. A few were brass but shaped in ways I'd never seen before. One corner had something that looked like a small organ. There were also drums with cymbals carved into their shells. Everything smelled like dust and old varnish. There was a set of guitars hanging on the wall, and each had a distinct look. One had a fretboard made of some dark wood, and the body looked uneven, as if someone carved it by hand. Another had strange metal inlays along the neck. I remember running my hand over its strings and feeling a kind of static under my fingertips. It was barely noticeable, so I thought it might just be static electricity in the dry basement air. I brought in my own gear the next day. I had a basic laptop, an audio interface, and a few microphones. I also dragged in some cables, stands, and a small keyboard I'd saved up for. I wanted to test everything right away, so I plugged in one of the old guitars and strummed a simple chord. The sound that came through my headphones felt oddly layered. I heard my chord, but I also heard this faint, dissonant echo. I took the headphones off and listened to the room itself. The same strange echo repeated for a moment, like a barely audible whisper. It made the hairs on my arms stand up, but I shrugged it off. I thought maybe the room was bouncing sound in an odd way. Over the next few days, I explored more of the studio. I tuned up some of the other stringed instruments. There was a small harp-like contraption that sat on a table near the corner. Its strings were thin and they produced a quiet, fragile tone. While I was tightening the pegs on it, I kept hearing a slight hiss behind me. Whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. The overhead light stayed on and it buzzed softly. I told myself I was just paranoid. New house, new sounds. It took time to get used to it. But in the back of my mind, I knew something felt off. One evening, I decided to record a short improvisation. I set up a microphone, pressed record, and started playing that weird harp-like instrument. The melody was a little rough. I was still figuring out how to hold my hands on those strings. But about halfway through, I heard a low whisper through my headphones. I stopped and looked around. The basement was empty. I pushed the headphones away from my ears and listened. No one else was there. The only noise I heard was my own breathing. I replayed the recording. My heart skipped when I heard the whisper again. It was faint, but I could tell it formed some sort of note that matched the melody I had been playing. It almost sounded like a voice singing along in a rough, scratchy tone. I didn't know if it was a technical glitch or something else. My mind started racing with logical explanations. Maybe I had some interference in the cables. Maybe there was a short in the mic. I told myself I'd switch out the mic and try again the next day. I woke up early and went back down to the basement. The air felt heavier than before, like there was a stale smell hanging around the instruments. I tested another mic, and I also tested a different audio interface. I picked up a small drum this time, a little hand drum with a thick hide. I tapped on it a few times. The tone was hollow, resonant, and had a slight ring to it. It sounded normal at first, but after I started a steady beat, I noticed the same kind of whisper in my headphones. It was quiet, almost hidden by the drum, but it was there, matching each thump with a barely audible hum. I felt my palms sweat, my heartbeat sped up, and I could feel this sharp tension in my shoulders. My throat got dry. I stopped playing. I turned off everything, stepped outside the studio, and took a few deep breaths. I tried to calm down. Then I grabbed my phone to listen back to the recording. Sure enough, there was a faint voice behind the drum. The sound gave me chills. It felt like someone was standing right next to me, mumbling a half-formed melody. That evening, I started thinking about whether I should stay in this house at all, but I'd already signed the lease. I was stuck here for at least a year. Over the next week, I noticed other odd things. The instruments, especially the guitars, always seemed a little more in tune whenever I walked into the studio. I'd leave a guitar slightly out of tune on purpose, but when I came back, it was perfect. I thought maybe I was forgetting that I'd tuned them. I also heard faint squeaks and creaks at night, like something was moving around in the basement. I kept the studio door locked, but I still heard these random sounds. One night, I woke up to the faint strum of a chord. I ran downstairs with a flashlight, but found nothing unusual. The guitars were still on the wall hooks. The keyboard was off. The basement lights were out, so I flipped them on, looked around, and saw no sign of anyone. But the air had that heavy feeling again. I decided to try to capture some video footage. I set up a camera in the corner of the studio, pointed at the instruments. I left the lights on low and hit record. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and tried to sleep. In the morning, I checked the footage. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then, around 2 a.m., I saw a slight flicker on camera. It was a small shift in the lighting near the old organ. The shadows around it seemed to move like someone brushed by, but there was no shape or figure. Right after that flicker, a few instruments on the wall started to vibrate. The guitar strings quivered as if they were plucked by invisible fingers. Then everything went still again. My stomach churned. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. It was real. I wasn't just imagining it. I spent most of that day pacing around my living room, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to call anyone and sound like a crazy person. I also didn't have the money to break my lease. A part of me felt drawn to keep experimenting, as if there was some creative potential here. I ended up going back into the studio that afternoon. I set up 2 mics, one near the guitars, another near the organ, and I began recording an improvised jam session. I used the old guitar with the metal inlays. The tone was warm, but there was an underlying hiss. As soon as I started playing a slow progression, I heard a whisper again, this time a bit clearer. It was following the notes. My heart pounded, but I kept playing. I wanted to see what would happen. The whisper grew louder, layering on top of my notes almost like a second instrument. When I stopped playing, the whisper hung in the air for a moment. My hands shook as I set down the guitar. Then, without warning, one of the other guitars on the wall strummed a single chord by itself. I jumped back. My foot bumped into a stand and I nearly fell over. That chord rang out, clear as day, and it sustained longer than any normal guitar chord should. My hair stood on end. I felt a trembling in my chest and a wave of goosebumps along my arms. The chord faded after what felt like a minute, although it was probably only a few seconds. The studio went quiet. My breathing was shallow. I packed up my equipment for the day and left, my hands clammy and my stomach tight. Over the next few days, I found myself strangely drawn to that space again. It was scary, but I couldn't resist the urge to test more instruments. Something about it felt like a challenge. I kept thinking about the possibility of capturing a unique sound. Part of me wondered if I was making some kind of historic discovery, like proof that something beyond normal human perception was influencing music. I tried to rationalize it as an audio phenomenon or some kind of feedback loop. But the more I recorded, the more these voices appeared. They never sounded like any living person. They were always slightly off-pitch, like they were trying to mimic the notes but couldn't get them perfectly. One night, I was playing that small harp-like instrument again when I noticed that multiple voices were joining in. They were quiet, but I could hear at least 3 distinct tones. They moved in and out of harmony, creating this eerie chord progression. My breath hitched. My fingers felt stiff, but I forced myself to keep plucking. I wanted to hear the pattern. I thought maybe it would fade out if I stopped. The voices grew in volume, pressing against my ears, almost drowning out my own playing. Then one of the drum heads let out a low rumble, even though I wasn't touching it. A string from the organ snapped with a sharp twang. I jumped and my knee banged into the table. That ended my session right there. I turned off everything and sat on the chair, breathing hard, trying not to panic. After that, I got nervous that things might escalate. It felt like the studio was leading me toward some final piece. Each time I played, more voices joined in. I started having trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint music in my dreams. My body felt sore and my head hurt. But every morning I went back downstairs to try again. It was like an obsession. I told myself I'd stop once I figured out what was happening. My rational mind said this was a bad idea, but I couldn't stay away. I also noticed that the instruments sometimes changed tuning on their own. I'd come in, check the strings, and see that they'd moved to a different pitch. It wasn't random. They all seemed to align in a certain scale. I recognized it as some kind of exotic scale I'd never really tried before. I put fresh batteries in my camera and recorded a long session. I picked up that old guitar and started playing in the scale I found. The voices began quietly, just a few faint hums matching my notes. Then, after about a minute, I heard a deeper voice in the distance, almost like a bass note. My chest fluttered, and my face felt hot. I had trouble keeping my hands steady, but I continued, following this strange melodic path. The rest of the instruments in the room resonated on their own. The organ pipes rattled, the drums vibrated, and I could see the harp strings shifting slightly, as if someone were tuning it. A thick tension filled the air, making it feel hard to breathe. My skin tingled all over. I had this overwhelming sense that if I finished whatever piece was forming, something would appear right there in front of me. I pushed on. My heart was beating so fast it hurt. My temples throbbed. I played chord after chord, guided by the tuning the instruments seemed to want. The whispers filled the room. I heard multiple voices now, each one distinct. forming a chorus that surrounded me. The lights flickered and the shadows on the wall moved in sync with the music. My mouth went dry and I swallowed hard. I wanted to stop, but my hands kept going, as if they weren't mine anymore. My legs trembled under the chair and sweat rolled down my back. The tension built to a point where I felt like I might faint. Then, right when the music reached a peak, I forced myself to yank my hands away from the strings. The voices lingered for a second, echoing the final chord. Then everything went silent. No hum, no whispers, no strange tuning. My breath came out in a loud gasp, and I realized I'd been holding it. My heart pounded against my ribs and I wiped sweat from my forehead. The overhead light flickered one last time, and then stayed steady. The instruments didn't move. I let out a shaky laugh, but it was more of a panicked exhale. I knew that if I had pushed any further, something would have come through. I could almost sense a shape forming in the air, but I stopped in time. I reviewed the footage later, and most of the audio was garbled with static once the voices started. The camera kept trying to focus, but there was nothing in front of it. The instruments, though, clearly vibrated on their own. I could see them move in the video. That was enough proof for me that I wasn't imagining things. I haven't tried to finish that piece since. The instruments remain down there, half-tuned to that weird scale. Sometimes when I walk by the basement door, I hear a faint note or two, like they're calling me back in. My chest tightens whenever that happens. My hands might twitch, but I don't go down unless I really have to. I keep the lights off, I keep the door locked. Every so often I stand at the top of the basement steps and I listen. I still feel tempted. Part of me wants to hear what would happen if I let the music complete itself, but another part of me feels sheer dread. My body reacts with a surge of adrenaline, and I get that feeling of pins and needles along my neck. For now, I'm not playing. I'm trying to ignore the voices and ignore the instruments that keep themselves in perfect pitch. I'm not sure how long I can hold out, but for now, I avoid it. I don't want to see whatever is waiting for me in that basement. I don't want to give it shape. I don't want it to step forward into the light. So that's the story of my house and the studio underneath it. I moved in for the convenience, and I got something else entirely. I record regular music upstairs in my living room now using just a small rig and my laptop. It's not the same as having a full studio, but I feel safer. The basement is always there, though. Sometimes I think I hear a small chord or a light hum drifting up through the floorboards. When that happens, my heart picks up speed, and I walk outside for fresh air. I try not to linger in the yard for too long, because I can still feel that pull from the basement window. It's like it's challenging me, reminding me that the final notes are still missing. If I ever play them, something will show up, and I'm not ready to find out what it is. I still remember the first time I walked into that basement. I didn't feel any wind on my face, but I heard these tiny bells rattling against each other. It was the kind of sound that makes you pause and check if you're imagining it. I wasn't. The noise came from the ceiling, where dozens of bells hung from old wooden beams. Some were brass, some were steel, others looked like ceramic. They were spaced at random intervals, clinking and chiming in odd rhythms that made no sense to me. I stood at the bottom of the stairs holding a flashlight, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. There was nothing but those bells and the unsettling echoes they produced. My heart pounded. My palms felt clammy. I felt a dull pressure in my chest, like the air itself pressed down on me. My reason for being there was simple enough. I was helping a friend, a collector of antiques, who needed someone to sort and catalog items stored in that basement. He told me the place had an odd vibe, but reassured me there were no rats or insects. He just said it felt off. I stepped into that space with a clipboard, ready to write down the condition of each piece, how many items there were, and if anything needed cleaning or repair. The basement walls were concrete with no windows. The overhead bulbs worked, but the lighting was weak, casting weird shadows across the beams. I could see the outline of each bell, some large enough to fill my palm, others as small as a thimble. All were suspended from hooks or strings. None looked dusty, which was strange for a basement filled with old furniture and crates. They looked polished, as if someone had been taking care of them. I did my best to ignore the bells at first. I wrote down the condition of a few pieces of furniture, opened a crate to see what was inside, and found nothing interesting there, just old plates. When I moved to the next corner, I heard a clear ring overhead. I froze. It sounded like one of those fancy restaurant bells, the kind you tap with your finger. But I hadn't touched anything. No breeze came through. I stood still, listening. The bell rang again. Then a second bell joined in with a higher pitch. I looked up and saw two bells swinging gently, as if a light gust had moved them. But I didn't feel a thing on my skin. That first night, I tried to shrug it off. I kept telling myself it was just some weird draft. Maybe the ventilation system was on, or maybe the temperature changes caused some airflow. But as I stood there, the bells started ringing in a pattern. It wasn't random. I heard 3 rings, a pause, then 1 ring, another pause, then 2 rings, then another pause. My heartbeat sped up. I glanced around to see if maybe someone was pulling a trick on me. But I was alone. My eyes scanned every corner. Nothing moved, except for those 2 bells still swinging in that slow, deliberate motion. I spent another hour in the basement that night. The bells settled eventually, and I finished my work as best I could. My breathing felt shallow the entire time. My shoulders were tense. When I headed upstairs, I closed the basement door behind me with a little more force than I intended. My friend asked me how it went, and I said it was fine, but that basement gave me a weird feeling. He said he wasn't surprised. I remember he looked a bit uneasy, but he didn't say anything else. He just told me I could come back the next day to keep working. That next day, I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was still out, so I felt a bit more comfortable. I went straight to the basement, but this time I paid close attention to the ceiling. I wanted to understand how these bells were arranged. I saw thin wires running across some beams. Other bells hung from fishing lines or thick cords. No 2 bells looked the same. Some had tiny inscriptions I couldn't read. One looked like it was made of some dark metal with dents and scratches. Another seemed to be some kind of silver alloy. They all had different shapes, some elongated, others round. While I examined them, I noticed a small shelf near one of the columns. There were old notebooks there, stacked with care. I picked one up and flipped through the pages. They were full of symbols and sketches of bells. I saw lines that looked like wave patterns and random letters that formed no words. At the top of one page, there was a heading, Communication Attempt Number 7. That made me pause. I flipped more pages and saw references to spirits and contact on the other side. I'm not the type of person who gets excited about supernatural stuff, but it felt unsettling. I kept reading until I found repeated references to these bells. The notebooks claimed they were used to open channels to invite transitory presences who haven't fully crossed over. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time studying these bells, trying to decode the sequences. I heard a faint chime overhead. I slammed the notebook shut and looked up. Nothing moved. My nerves were on edge. I put the notebook back on the shelf and tried to focus on my task. But the more I stayed in that basement, the heavier the air felt. My chest got tight again. I decided to wrap up quickly and leave. I only recorded a few items before I shut off the lights and climbed the stairs. I told my friend I had to go home early. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at me with concern and said we could talk later. That night I couldn't sleep well. My mind replayed those bells. I woke up in a cold sweat around 3 in the morning, my heart racing. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm down. My thoughts wandered to those notes. Communication, spirits, transitory presences. I kept telling myself it was all nonsense, that there had to be a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day I returned to the house with a plan. I would stay in that basement late into the night and see if I could figure out what was causing the bells to ring. I didn't tell my friend my plan. I just said I would be working late. I went down after dinner, armed with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a notepad. I set my phone to record audio too. The basement was quiet for the first hour. I shuffled some crates around, checking for any drafts or hidden vents. I saw no evidence of any mechanical device or strings that might move the bells. The place looked totally normal, aside from the weird arrangement on the beams. I was about to give up, thinking maybe the bells wouldn't ring that night when I heard it. A single, soft ding to my left. I turned my flashlight and saw a small brass bell swaying back and forth. A chill ran up my arms. I walked over, looked at it, and felt no breeze or temperature change. The bell slowed to a stop. I stepped back and waited. Another bell, slightly bigger, rang on the opposite side of the room. My chest tightened. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I wiped it away and forced myself to remain calm. I clicked the record button on my phone. The bells began chiming again. There was a pattern, 3 short rings, a pause, 1 long ring, another pause, 2 short rings. It repeated. I stood there listening, writing down the sequence on my notepad. I wrote each ring as a dot or a dash, hoping it might form some kind of code. My breathing was shallow and my legs felt stiff. I wanted to move, but a sense of dread kept me rooted in place. After a few minutes, the bells stopped. The basement went silent. I played back the recording, but I only heard the rings. No voices or footsteps. I walked around, shining my flashlight at the beams, trying to see if there was something I missed. Then I spotted a little door in the far corner behind a stack of broken chairs. It looked like a crawl space. I hadn't noticed it before. I moved the chairs aside and tried the handle. It opened. Inside was a small compartment lined with shelves full of more bells, all wrapped in cloth. Some shelves held more notebooks and scraps of paper. I grabbed one of the notebooks and flipped through it. On the first page, it mentioned ongoing attempts to reach them. The writing included diagrams of the basement ceiling with marks indicating positions of each bell. I felt a pressure on my chest again. My stomach churned. I didn't want to be there anymore, but I was too curious to walk away. I read more lines. No recorded deaths, but presence is undeniable. These bells serve as conduits. They respond even when no breeze is present. The patterns suggest intelligence. They are trying to reach out. I put the notebook back and stepped away. I felt lightheaded. My hands trembled. I needed air, so I stumbled out of that crawl space and climbed the stairs. I stood in the hallway breathing hard, trying to clear my head. My friend was sitting in the living room reading. He saw my face and asked what was wrong. I hesitated. Then I told him I found more bells in a hidden compartment. He looked surprised, but not shocked. He admitted he had never explored the entire basement. He asked if I felt unsafe. I told him the basement felt suffocating, and I described the ringing pattern. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. He looked serious and said he had heard the bells a few times, but assumed it was just the old house settling. We agreed that we would look for an expert, maybe someone who knew about old signal bells or seance equipment. The next day, I returned to the basement, determined to capture clearer audio. I set up my phone in the center of the room and started recording. I walked around, tapping beams to see if they were loose or if there was something that might make the bells move. Everything looked solid. After about 30 minutes, a single bell started ringing again. I rushed to my phone to make sure it was recording. Then a second bell joined in, then a third. My heart pounded. The sound was almost hypnotic, but I forced myself to focus on the pattern. I wrote it down again. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. I repeated those marks in my notepad, hoping I could translate them. During this sequence, my mind wandered to the notes about entities that weren't really dead but stuck between dimensions. I hated the idea, but it started making some sense. Maybe these bells were set up as a kind of invitation. Whoever used to own this place might have believed they could speak with these entities. As I stood there, I couldn't see any figures or shadows beyond the beams. There was only the sound of metal and ceramic hitting each other. The tension in my neck grew stronger. My shoulders felt tight. My mouth went dry. I tried swallowing, but I only felt a lump in my throat. I stayed that night until the bells went silent. Then I left the basement and reviewed my recordings on a laptop. The pattern was clear in the audio, but it still meant nothing to me. I decided to keep searching the notebooks. Over the next few days, I studied them every chance I got. Most pages were disorganized, but I found references to Morse-like sequences. I saw attempts to interpret them as letters or numbers, but everything seemed inconclusive. I saw scribbles about responding to a call, indecipherable frequencies, and tuning forks. The writer believed these bells worked as a group, resonating in a way that opened a path for trapped entities. I became convinced the bells were trying to summon something. I didn't see any actual apparitions, but I felt a suffocating presence in that basement. I noticed the air turned stale whenever the bells rang. My breathing felt harder, like the oxygen was thinning out. My friend and I decided we needed to remove the bells to break whatever was happening. We spent a whole morning taking them down. We were careful. We placed each bell into padded boxes, labeling them. The entire time, we heard soft clicks and faint rings from the bells still on the beams. My friend's forehead was damp with sweat, and he looked anxious. I felt my chest tighten again. We worked quickly and got them all down. By afternoon, the beams were bare, and the basement felt less eerie. But that night, I heard bells in my dreams. I woke up sweating again, and I had the distinct sense that the ringing wasn't done with me. I tried to go about my normal day, telling myself I was just freaked out, but I felt a strange tug to go back down there. When I did, I found one bell still hanging. It was small, silver, and hidden behind a thick beam near the ceiling. I reached up and removed it, but as soon as I touched it, I heard a metallic rattle from the boxes behind me. My breath caught in my throat. The boxes stayed closed, but I knew I heard something inside them shift. My chest pounded like a drum. I felt my hands shaking. I took the silver bell to the living room and wrapped it in cloth. Later, I heard faint sounds coming from that basement, like someone tapping on a pipe, but no one was down there. My friend stayed in his room, and I sat in the hallway, flashlight in hand, waiting for any movement. Nothing happened except for those sporadic clicks. Around midnight, I forced myself to go down one last time. I opened the basement door. The lights were off, but I turned them on. The basement looked empty without all those bells. I heard a slow, singular chiming noise from somewhere in the corner. I moved the crates around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. My arms tingled with goosebumps. I said out loud, "I'm done. I'm not going to engage anymore." My voice shook. My throat felt tight. I climbed the stairs, flicked off the lights, and shut the door. That was the last time I went down there. My friend eventually sold the bells to some private collectors, and he sealed the crawl space. I never found out if the patterns really meant anything, or if it was just my imagination magnifying a strange phenomenon. But I know what I heard, and I know how it made me feel. That basement still gives me a chill whenever I think about it. Sometimes I imagine those bells chiming in the darkness, calling out to something that isn't exactly dead, waiting for a response from whoever or whatever might be caught in between. And I'm just glad I never found out what that response could be. I never expected to find something so unsettling in a place that looked so ordinary. I had just moved into a new apartment, hoping for a fresh start. The rent was decent, the location worked with my job, and the layout seemed fine at first glance. I saw it once before signing the lease, and nothing looked unusual. The furniture was a bit old, and there was a guest bedroom that I assumed I would barely use. I didn't question the landlord about the decor or the furnishings, even though some of it seemed outdated. I just wanted a place where I could unpack my life and move on. On my first night, I finished hauling boxes around 10 at night. I felt exhausted. I placed most of my things in the living room and kitchen. Then I opened the door to the guest bedroom to check if there was any space for extra storage. The room had a small twin bed, a wooden dresser, and an antique rug spread across the floor. It was a deep red Persian rug with gold details. It looked worn but still sturdy. I thought it added some character to an otherwise bland room, so I left it there and figured I'd deal with it later. I went to sleep in my own bedroom that night. I was too tired to notice anything. But the next evening, after work, I decided to have a real look around. I wanted to see if there were any hidden issues. I looked at the windows, the closet, and the bathroom. Then I walked into the guest room again. That's when I noticed a dark patch on the rug. It looked like a stain, but I wasn't sure if it was part of the rug's pattern. I brushed my fingers against it. The fibers were the same as the rest of the rug, but there was a slight discoloration. It looked almost like a faint shape of someone crouching, but it was so subtle I assumed I was just imagining it. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that odd shape. I forced myself to ignore it, blaming my overactive mind. Around midnight, I woke up feeling anxious. I heard a soft creaking noise like gentle footsteps or a slow shuffle in the hallway. My apartment has wooden floors, so any movement can cause a creak. I sat up in bed and listened. I couldn't see anything in the dark. My skin prickled, my heart pounded. I was sure someone was there. Then the noise stopped. I felt silly and laid back down. The next morning, I checked the hallway for any sign of footprints or weird marks, but I found nothing. I spent the day trying to focus on my job. I work from home sometimes, so that evening I stayed in the living room with my laptop. At around 7, I realized I needed something from the guest room, a box of old files I had placed in the corner. When I walked in, my eyes went straight to the rug. That same patch looked darker. I turned on the overhead light to see it better. It looked like the shadow of a person leaning forward. The edges of the stain seemed blurry, but the middle was more defined. It unnerved me. My throat went dry. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the lighting, or maybe the rug was dirty in that spot. I kneeled to get a closer look. I couldn't smell anything strange. The rug felt normal. I pressed on it. It wasn't damp. I decided to ignore it and grabbed my box of files. When I left the room, I felt a weird urge to look back. Something told me not to turn around, but I did anyway. The patch seemed to have a slight outline of an arm. I felt a jolt in my chest. I closed the door. Later that night, I heard a tapping sound in the hallway. It was faint, like someone tapping fingernails against wood. My heart started racing. I stood up from the couch and walked to the hall. It went silent. I checked the front door, but it was locked. My windows were closed. I stepped closer to the guest room door, thinking maybe an open window in there caused some movement. The door was shut, and I didn't see any light under the frame. I reached for the knob. My hand shook. I told myself I was being ridiculous, so I turned the knob and opened the door a crack. I flicked the light on. Nothing jumped out. The bed was where I left it. The dresser was the same, and the rug was in the middle of the floor. The only difference was that the shape on the rug looked a bit bigger, almost like a crouched figure with a faint line around where the head would be. I stayed in the doorway, too nervous to step inside. Then I heard the tapping sound again, except it seemed to come from the rug itself, like something inside it was scratching to get out. My throat tightened. I closed the door and backed away. I spent that night on the couch, with the TV turned on for some background noise. I wanted to drown out every small creak and shuffle. When I finally drifted off, I had a dream about something calling me from across the room. The voice was muffled. My chest felt heavy. I saw a shape on the floor beckoning me. I woke up with a jolt, breathing hard. I was covered in sweat. The apartment was quiet, but I felt watched. By the next day, I decided that rug had to go. I rolled it up and dragged it into the hallway. It felt heavier than I expected, almost like it didn't want to move. My arms strained, my shoulders burned. I finally got it out into the main corridor. I left it there and went back into my apartment. A few hours later, I heard a scraping sound. I looked through the peephole and saw the rug shifted a foot closer to my door. That didn't make any sense. Nobody else on the floor had come by. I would have heard them. Yet there it was, closer than before. My stomach twisted. My breathing got rough. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive the rug to the dump that afternoon. I wouldn't even try to sell it. I just wanted it gone. I dragged it down the hallway and into the elevator. I drove to the nearest waste facility. When I tossed the rug onto a pile of trash bags, I felt a weird twinge of guilt, like I was abandoning something that belonged to me. I shook that off. I went back home, trying to feel relieved. I thought that was the end of it. But that night, as I sat on my couch, I heard that quiet, dragging sound again. It was in my hallway. My legs felt weak, and a chill slid up my spine. I walked to the door, trembling. The knob felt cold in my hand. When I opened the door, the rug was there, rolled up against the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back. Then I leaned forward to touch it. It felt solid and real. I didn't know how it came back. I couldn't explain it. I stared at it for a long time, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. Then I forced myself to drag it back into the apartment. I left it by the front door, planning to figure out a different way to dispose of it. That night, I heard footsteps. They were soft, almost like bare feet moving slowly across the wooden floor. I walked out of my bedroom and flipped on the hallway light. I saw the rug unrolled, leading from the front door to the guest room. That shape was spread out across it again, bigger than before. It looked like it was on all fours, reaching an arm forward. My entire body shook. I wanted to run, but this was my home. I moved toward it, keeping the hallway light shining on it. My breath was fast. I knelt down and tried to see if there was an actual figure there or just an image. The shape looked flat but dark, like a stain. As I hovered my hand over it, I felt a slight coolness coming off the surface. Suddenly, I heard a creak by the guest room door. I jerked my head up and saw a shadow pass along the wall. I jumped back and my hand grazed the rug. My skin felt clammy, and a cold wave passed through my arm. I yanked my hand away and scrambled up, backing toward my bedroom. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I should call someone, but I didn't know who to call. The landlord, the police? None of that made sense. What would I say? That a rug was haunting my apartment? I decided to sleep with my bedroom door locked and a chair braced under the doorknob. I shut off all the lights, hoping I could just ignore everything for the night. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a deep sense of dread. I stared at the door. I heard slow scraping sounds on the other side, like someone sliding their palms across the wood. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat beading on my face. My mind was racing. I waited, listening to every faint movement. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I opened the door slowly. The rug was back in the guest room, spread out perfectly on the floor. The shape looked even larger. I could see what appeared to be a hunched back and a faint outline of a head. I felt dizzy. My lungs felt tight. I took a deep breath and walked toward it. My legs shook, but I forced myself to keep going. When I got close, I noticed something like a hand extending from the shadow. It wasn't raised above the carpet. It was woven into the pattern, but it seemed to point toward me like it was reaching. I wanted to get rid of that thing once and for all. I marched to the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and grabbed a pair of heavy-duty scissors. I stormed back to the guest room, dropped to my knees, and started cutting into the rug. The scissors jammed after the first few cuts. The fibers felt thicker than they should. I put all my strength into it. The scissors snapped in half. I lost my balance and fell back. I crawled away, my chest heaving. The cut I made was small, maybe 2 inches, but I saw threads fraying. A strange odor rose, like dust and something stale, but it was more intense than old carpet normally smells. I felt panic building. I decided to try something else. I pulled out my phone and searched for an emergency junk removal or a local disposal service. I called the first number I found. They couldn't come that day, and even if they could, the idea of explaining the rug's weird behavior made me uneasy. I thought about dragging it to the street and leaving it for someone to pick up, but I was afraid it would just show up in my apartment again. That sense of dread kept growing in my gut. That evening, I sat in the living room, staring at the guest room door. It was closed, and I swore I could see the bottom edge of the rug sticking out a bit. There was a slight gap under the door, and I thought I saw a shadow moving back and forth. I got up, clenched my fists, and opened the door. The rug was lying there, the shape bigger than ever. It took up almost the entire center of the rug now, like a crouched figure with long arms. My throat felt tight, and my eyes stung from not blinking. I stepped forward, ignoring the urge to run. I hovered my foot over the rug. I wanted to test if I could stand on that shape. My leg trembled, but I pressed my foot down. It felt cold and oddly soft, like sinking into a thick cushion. I tried to pull my foot away, but something held it in place. My calves cramped. I leaned forward, using both hands to brace against the bed. I tugged hard, and my foot popped free. I nearly fell back. I stumbled into the wall and banged my shoulder. Pain shot through my arm. I groaned and clutched it, cursing under my breath. My heart was racing out of control. I thought I would pass out. I staggered out of the room and slammed the door shut. My body was trembling. I could taste bile in my mouth. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees. I stayed there for a long time, not sure what to do. The air felt thick, and it smelled faintly of something old and musty. I finally picked myself up and walked to the kitchen. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night, so I packed a small bag with clothes, grabbed my wallet and keys, and left. I locked the door behind me, but I sensed that it didn't matter. I spent the night at a motel nearby, telling myself I'd talk to the landlord first thing in the morning. When I got back the next day, the apartment was deathly quiet. I opened the door cautiously. The place looked normal at first glance. The living room was the same. Then I noticed the guest room door was wide open. The rug lay half in the hallway, half in the guest room, like something had pulled it out. The shape was more defined, like a figure crouching with its arms extended. It looked frozen in mid-action, like it was reaching for the door. I felt the blood rush from my face. My fingertips tingled. I couldn't even breathe for a moment. I took a shaky step forward. The floor squeaked under me. My stomach churned. I gripped my phone in my hand, but I couldn't figure out who to call. Then I heard the softest whisper of fabric sliding along the floor. The rug moved an inch toward me. I backed up, my heart pounding so hard it hurt my chest. My mind screamed for me to leave, but a strange part of me wanted to see what would happen. I took another step back. It slid again, a slow glide. I didn't wait anymore. I turned and ran for the door. I slammed it behind me and fled down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was inside the elevator. My hands shook as I pressed the lobby button. My shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. I had no plan. I just wanted to get away. So that's it. I'm telling you this from a friend's couch where I've been sleeping for a few nights. I haven't been back to the apartment since. I told the landlord there was a problem with the furniture, but I didn't say more than that. I have no idea what's happening in there now. Maybe the rug keeps spreading that shape until it fills the entire space. Maybe it's just waiting for me to come back. All I know is I still dream about it. I wake up thinking I hear those footsteps in the hall or that tapping against wood. My foot still feels cold sometimes, like I never really got it out of that rug. I can't shake the feeling that it's calling me back, waiting for me to give in. I'm not going back, but I'm also not sure how long I can keep running from it. I never wanted to spend a week in an old country house during storm season, but I needed some time alone. The place looked cheap and quiet in the photos. I thought it would help me clear my mind, get away from traffic and noise, and maybe focus on my writing. When I first pulled up to the driveway, the house looked fine on the outside. It had a wide porch, a few large windows, and a roof covered in dark shingles. The yard was a bit overgrown with some weeds and tall grass near the fence, but I shrugged it off. Inside, the furniture smelled dusty, and the walls needed a fresh coat of paint. There was a slight creaking from the wooden floorboards, especially near the living room window. I figured it was just the natural settling of an old structure. I had no clue what would happen over the next days. I had no clue about the footsteps, the scratching, or the strange laughter. If I did, I might have turned around and driven back to the city without unpacking. On my first night, I cooked a quick meal with some groceries I brought along. I boiled pasta, made a small sauce, and ate at a small wooden table in the living room. The overhead light flickered a bit, which made me uneasy, but I decided it was just faulty wiring. After dinner, I checked all the windows. I made sure they were locked, then headed to the bedroom at the far end of the hall. It was colder than I expected, so I turned on a small electric heater in the corner. Then I lay in bed and listened to the quiet. No cars, no sirens, just the gentle rustling of leaves outside. I felt relieved that it was peaceful, and I drifted off to sleep. Around midnight, I woke up because I heard a soft thump above my head. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something running across the roof. I rolled over and tried to ignore it, but the thumps turned into steady steps. I heard them tapping along the length of the roof right over the bedroom. They moved slowly, almost like a person pacing back and forth. I couldn't dismiss the sound. It felt too regular, too deliberate. My pulse quickened. I sat up, turned on the lamp beside the bed, and waited to see if it stopped. The steps went on for a while, then stopped abruptly. I didn't hear them anymore that night, so I eventually fell back asleep, though my body stayed tense. In the morning, I thought maybe I had imagined the entire thing. I got dressed and went outside to see if there were any signs of an animal. The yard was damp, and I noticed water dripping from the gutters. I circled around the house with my coffee mug in hand. There were no obvious footprints on the ground near the walls, but something caught my eye on the side of the roof. A few of the shingles looked off color, like something had scratched away some of the grime. I used a small ladder I found in the garage to climb closer. When I got near the top, I saw faint prints. They looked like footprints, arranged in pairs, but smaller than a typical adult human foot. I felt a chill. The space between each pair of prints looked narrow, so it appeared like something had walked upright. I tried running my hand across them to see if it was just discoloration. My fingers bumped against shallow grooves. I pulled back. Whatever made those marks had some kind of claws or sharp edges. I didn't know what to make of it. I climbed down carefully, feeling uneasy. I had the urge to drive away and never come back, but I told myself it must have been some weird animal that somehow stepped like that. That second night, I stayed up later. I read an old book I found in one of the living room drawers. It was a boring travel guide about local hiking trails, so it didn't distract me much. I kept glancing at the ceiling, waiting for sounds. By around 10, I felt drowsy. I was about to turn off the lamp when I heard a faint scraping noise near the front porch. It sounded like nails dragging across wood. My heart kicked into high gear. I put on my boots and grabbed a flashlight. The weather was calm, so I stepped outside. The porch light was weak, so I aimed my flashlight around. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I didn't see anything unusual, just a few old chairs, some cobwebs. Then I heard the scraping again, above me, somewhere on the roof. I stepped off the porch and looked up. My flashlight beam showed the shingles and the old chimney. I couldn't see any shape or movement, yet I swore I heard something shift, like a weight shifting across the beams. It took everything in me not to run back inside. I forced myself to walk around to the side of the house, scanning for movement. Nothing. It was quiet. Eventually, I went back in, locked the door, and tried to calm down. I couldn't sleep well that night. I woke up at every small sound. By the time the third day arrived, the sky looked gray and heavy with clouds. I felt exhausted and irritated at myself for getting spooked. I decided to check the attic. Maybe there was a raccoon or some animal living up there. I took the narrow staircase near the kitchen. It led up to a low-ceilinged attic with old boxes, a rickety chair, and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust particles floated in the stale air. I poked around, shining my flashlight into corners. There was no sign of a nest or droppings. Everything looked dry, undisturbed. I moved along the beams to get closer to the roof. I tapped on a few boards with my foot, checking for holes or cracks. It all seemed intact. I couldn't explain the noises. I stayed there for at least half an hour, trying to find any sign that an animal was nesting. I found none, so I went back down feeling even more unsettled. My stomach felt tight, and my shoulders ached from tension. That evening, the weather shifted. Rain started to fall and the wind picked up. The house groaned a bit under the gusts. I paced around the living room, occasionally peeking through the windows, but the storm made it hard to see anything outside. Around 9, the power flickered. The lights dimmed twice, then came back. I decided to prepare some candles just in case. While rummaging in the kitchen drawers, I heard something odd, a muffled laugh. It sounded like a soft chuckle, carried by the wind. I stood still. The hair on the back of my neck rose. I turned off the faucet and listened carefully. The rain drummed on the roof in a steady downpour. Through that noise, I thought I heard it again. The laugh was faint, but it sounded close. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the front door. My hands shook when I reached for the doorknob. I stepped onto the porch. Rain soaked the wooden planks and water dripped from the porch roof. The wind blew raindrops into my face. I clicked on my flashlight and shone it around the yard. I didn't see anyone, but the laughter seemed to come from above, near the roof line. Then came those footsteps again, heavy and deliberate, moving along the top of the house. My chest tightened and I stepped back inside, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced. I had no explanation for what was out there. I tried to calm down by turning on the TV in the living room, but the signal was poor. Static flickered across the screen. The storm must have damaged something. I paced back and forth, checking the windows every 10 minutes, but the downpour made it impossible to see more than a few feet. At one point, I heard the scraping of claws across the rooftop. It sounded like the thing was circling. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat on my forehead despite the cold air. I wondered if it wanted me to come outside. I wondered if it was testing me. Sometime after midnight, the storm quieted. I sat on the couch with a small lamp turned on behind me. The air smelled damp and the rooms felt clammy. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I was too rattled to drive in the dark on those winding roads. I was also stubborn. I wanted to figure out what was happening. I clenched my jaw and decided to wait until dawn. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a squeak on the porch floorboards. It sounded like a footstep, but heavier than my own weight. My body tensed. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight again, and approached the front door. I kept the lights off inside to avoid alerting whoever, or whatever, stood out there. Carefully, I peeked through a small gap in the curtain. The porch was dark, only lit by the faint glow of the moon through the thinning clouds. I couldn't see anyone. I waited, barely breathing, for another sound. Then, a single, loud thump against the door made me jump. I almost dropped my flashlight. My heart hammered so hard it hurt my chest. I forced myself to turn the knob, flung the door open, and aimed the flashlight outside. There was nothing. The porch was empty. My breath came in short, quick bursts, and I felt my hands shaking. I stepped out onto the porch and swept the flashlight beam across the front yard. The rain-soaked grass glistened under the moonlight. A few puddles reflected the light. There were no footprints on the porch itself. I moved the beam slowly upward toward the roof. Still nothing. As I backed into the house again, I thought I heard a low chuckle behind me, but it could have been the wind. I locked the door and stayed awake until sunrise. Morning brought no comfort. I headed out to check the roof again and found fresh tracks, the same strange biped footprints, but now they looked a little bigger, as if the creature's feet had pressed down harder on the wet surface. There were fine scratches etched between some of the shingles, like it had dragged its claws while walking. My stomach churned, and I felt a wave of nausea. I climbed down the ladder unsteadily and spent an hour debating if I should leave. But something in me wanted proof. I wanted to know what this thing was. On the 5th night, I set up a simple plan. I positioned a large flashlight on the windowsill in the bedroom and aimed it at the roof outside. I turned off all other lights in the house and waited. The evening air felt thick with humidity. Occasionally, the wind rattled the trees, and I could smell the wet earth. I sat in the bedroom with my eyes locked on the beam of light shining onto the roof's edge. My heart wouldn't slow down. Every little noise made me flinch. Around 10, I heard it again, light tapping across the roof. Then a harsher scrape, like nails on concrete. My throat went dry. I inched closer to the window. My flashlight revealed a portion of the shingles. They were slick with leftover rain. I kept waiting for a shape to cross that beam of light. Suddenly, I heard a short burst of laughter again. This time it sounded clearer, almost like a person's voice. It didn't echo or fade. It cut off abruptly. I jumped to my feet and rushed into the hallway to get a better angle from the living room window. I tripped on a loose floorboard and nearly fell. My heart was racing and I felt shaky all over. I reached the living room, flipped off the light switch, and peeked out the window facing the porch. The roof above that area was darker, outside the range of the bedroom flashlight. I tried to see if something was moving there, but the window was streaked with water from the earlier rain. My breath sounded too loud in the silence. Then I heard another set of footsteps above me, heavier than before. They headed toward the back of the house. I ran into the kitchen, which had a small window overlooking the rear. I flicked on the outdoor floodlight. It illuminated the backyard, but the roof remained shadowed. No sign of anything. I stood there, adrenaline coursing through my veins, until I felt dizzy. My legs felt weak and my mouth tasted dry. I forced myself to swallow and think. If I went outside, maybe I could catch a glimpse of it. That idea made my chest tighten with dread. The memory of those footprints and the laughter kept me rooted in place. I didn't want to be lured into some trap. At the same time, I was sick of feeling cornered. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I shut off the floodlight and retreated to the living room. I sank into the couch, glaring at the ceiling. The footsteps continued for a while, pacing across the rooftop. Every few minutes, I heard that scraping sound, like claws dragging on old shingles. My head pounded and I felt sweat beading on my forehead. There was nothing I could do except wait for daylight. By the 6th day, I was exhausted. My eyes were bloodshot, and my hands shook whenever I tried to pick up my coffee cup. The weather forecast warned of another storm that night. I knew it would bring more noise and maybe more of those quiet laughs. I spent the day double-checking the attic, walking the perimeter of the house, and searching for any logical explanation. I found none. The only thing I discovered were more faint scratches on the siding near the roofline. It looked as if the creature climbed along the edges, almost as if it wanted me to notice. That night, I sat by the front window, listening to the rain hammer the roof. The wind whipped water against the glass, making it hard to see anything outside. Lightning flashed now and then, revealing the silhouette of the porch railing and a bit of the yard beyond. The thunder shook the windows, rattling the panes. My body tensed at every flash. Then I heard the laughter start up again, mixed with the sound of rain. It rose and fell, then stopped. My throat went tight. I felt my heart race as I stared into the darkness. Between claps of thunder, I heard the footsteps again. They were slow this time, almost careful. Then I caught a glimpse of movement through the window, high up on the roof near the peak. Lightning flared, and I saw a shape for the briefest second. It stood upright, about the size of a person, but hunched. Its arms, or maybe they were wings, were folded at its sides. I felt my stomach twist. The shape vanished before I could register more details. Another flash lit the rooftop, but it was gone. My hands shook on the windowsill. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what I saw. The presence didn't show itself again that night, but the footsteps continued until dawn. I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my neck, feeling every beat of my heart throb in my ears. I don't know if it was trying to intimidate me or invite me outside, but I stayed where I was. I drifted in and out of sleep, jolting awake whenever the footsteps paused or the rain changed rhythm. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. I packed my bags, tossed them into my car, and locked up the house. I didn't bother cleaning up. I just wanted to leave. Before driving off, I walked to the spot where I'd first seen those footprints on the roof. The shingles were damp and stained. The footprints were still there, claw marks trailing between them. I felt a final wave of dread. Then I got in my car, started the engine, and headed back to the main road. I left that place behind, but I can still picture those prints. Sometimes I wake up, sure I can hear those slow steps across a rooftop, waiting for someone to investigate. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever want to find out. But I remember its laughter mixing with the rain, and that's enough to keep me awake at night. I first heard about the abandoned building from a local historian who insisted there were fascinating records of the neighborhood hidden inside. He said the place had been shut down for decades. Most people claimed there was nothing valuable left. But I felt a pull. I can't explain it in any complicated way. I just wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to check every floor, every dusty corridor, and every forgotten room, hoping I might find something that told a story about this city's past. I reached the main entrance in the late afternoon. The front doors had broken glass scattered around the concrete steps. I could see a few old boards hammered across one side of the doorframe, but there was enough space to squeeze through if I ducked. I tried not to make too much noise when I entered, although it probably didn't matter. The place was obviously deserted. There was a faint smell of old books and stale air. My boots echoed on the cracked tile floor. I immediately took out my notebook and wrote down the date, the time, and my first impression. This building feels heavier inside than it looks from the outside. I don't know why I wrote that. Maybe I just sensed something off about the atmosphere. I started on the ground floor and worked my way up. Most of the lower floors looked trashed. Graffiti on the walls, broken pieces of furniture, shattered windows. I found some old newspapers piled in one corner of a hallway. They were from decades ago, yellowed and brittle. I flipped through a few pages, careful not to rip them, and jotted down any details that caught my eye. Headlines about local businesses, missing pets, announcements for community events. Nothing dramatic, but I still took the time to record it in my notebook. That's what I do. I collect small pieces of history so I can piece together a bigger picture later. By the time I reached the 10th floor, dusk was settling in. I had a flashlight, but I tried to preserve its batteries by only clicking it on in the darkest areas. Most of the floors had plenty of windows, and the late sun gave me enough light to walk around carefully. But I started noticing something peculiar. As I climbed higher, I felt a slight pressure in the air. It was like my ears popped at some point, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. I rubbed the sides of my head to get rid of the sensation, thinking maybe I was just tired. I paused to take a break on the 14th floor near a dusty office room. My throat felt dry, so I drank some water from the bottle in my backpack. I scribbled a note about the temperature. It seemed cooler up here compared to the floors below. There was a chilly draft in the hallway, which was surprising because most of the windows on this level seemed intact. I checked them. They were dirty, but no broken glass. I felt a small shiver crawl up my arms, so I put on my jacket. At the 15th floor, I started hearing a soft noise. At first, I assumed it was just the wind or some loose fixture, but it had a strange quality. It was low and long, like a faint whistle. I paused, clicked on my flashlight, and scanned the area. There was a big room filled with scattered chairs and old desks. The windows were boarded up, so I had to rely on my flashlight. I walked around, aiming the beam in corners. Dust particles swirled in the air, reflecting the light. I couldn't see any open vents or big cracks, so I couldn't figure out where that whistling was coming from. I tried not to let it bother me, and I continued taking quick notes about the furniture and the scattered papers on the floor. I decided to keep climbing. The building supposedly had 16 floors, plus some rooftop access. I wanted to check the top floor, then maybe the roof if it was accessible. The stairwell got narrower as I went up. The lights obviously didn't work, so I moved step by step, shining my flashlight on the cracked walls. The air felt even colder. My breathing turned shallow, and my jacket didn't seem enough to keep me warm. When I got to the 16th floor, I noticed there was only one hallway leading to a single door on the left. I expected several doors, but this floor looked different from the rest. The walls were a dull white, stripped of paint and patches. There were no decorations, no leftover furniture, nothing. I tried the doorknob. It turned with some resistance, creaking loudly. I pushed the door open and stepped into a large, empty space. The first thing I saw was a single window on the opposite side of the room. I kept the flashlight pointed at the center of that room. My heart pounded because it was eerily silent, except for that faint whistle I'd heard before, but now it sounded more like a soft hiss. I pointed the flashlight toward the window and noticed it was closed. The glass looked grimy and scratched. The window was set in a metal frame and there didn't seem to be any cracks or holes. I stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. Then I heard it. My name. It was quiet but clear, and it seemed to come from the direction of the window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. I lifted my flashlight higher and stepped closer to the window. My name came again, a hushed, drawn-out sound that made my hair stand on end. I thought maybe it was the wind somehow forming sounds, or maybe a trick of my imagination, but I felt sure I heard it distinctly. I whispered, "Who's there?" I got no reply, just that slow hiss that almost resembled speech. I grabbed my phone. I thought I should record this. I opened a voice recording app, pressed record, and spoke into it saying, "It's January 12th. I'm on the 16th floor. There's this strange sound near the window." Then I paused to let the phone capture the hissing noise. I waited at least 15 seconds, listening. My heart pounded in my ears. After a while, I stopped the recording and played it back. All I heard was static. There was no voice, no hiss, nothing else. Just a low, crackling static. My own voice was gone too. It was like the phone hadn't recorded me at all, just a buzz. I tried again, asking questions out loud, waiting for a response and then playing it back. The same result. Total static. I felt a wave of anxiety. My hands got clammy. I kept wiping them on my pants. I moved closer to the window, but I didn't touch it. I shone my flashlight across the glass. I noticed faint fingerprints on the surface. They looked old. Then the hissing returned, and it sounded like it was saying my name again. My stomach twisted. I reached out to the window frame, thinking I might open it, but I stopped myself. It felt cold to the touch, almost like metal that had been sitting in a freezer. I pulled my hand away. Time passed without me realizing. I checked my watch and saw it was around 7 p.m. The sky outside had darkened. I could see only a dim glow through the dusty glass. The rest of the floor remained pitch black, except for the circle of light from my flashlight. My heart rate started to slow down a bit as I took a few deep breaths. I told myself I'd just do a quick check of the window lock, then head back downstairs. I reached for the lock. It was stiff, rusted, and covered in grime. But while my fingers hovered over the latch, I heard a distinct thumping sound. It came from the glass itself, like a gentle knock. I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The thumping repeated in a steady rhythm. It sounded like a heartbeat. I don't consider myself a superstitious person, but that moment shook me. My arms broke out in goosebumps and I felt a tingle along my neck. I was alone in that large, empty room. The only object there was the window. It looked ordinary, except it sounded like it had its own pulse. I edged backward. My legs felt weak. I backed into the door I'd come through. My mind ran in circles, trying to come up with a logical reason for what I was hearing. Then the hissing came again, more insistent this time. It stretched out my name with a metallic echo that made my teeth clench. I considered leaving right then, but curiosity got the best of me. I set my backpack on the floor, rummaged for my small audio recorder. I use an old digital recorder sometimes for interviews or notes. I figured maybe the phone's microphone was defective. I pressed the record button, held it out toward the window, and stared at the glass. The noise continued, the same rhythmic thumping and that strange hiss. I whispered a question. "What do you want?" The hiss didn't form words, but I felt like it was calling to me, urging me closer. After a few minutes, I stopped the recording and played it back. Static. The entire track was a wash of static with occasional pops. No voice, no hissing, no heartbeat, just a dull crackle. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. My chest tightened, and I had trouble inhaling. I blinked away the sweat dripping into my eyes. I wasn't sure if I was imagining this. Everything around me felt heavier. My head pounded, and my shoulders tensed. I tried to calm myself by taking slow, deep breaths, but the air felt thin. I looked at the window again. It seemed to glow, very faintly, like it had a small internal light. I switched off my flashlight to see if I could notice it better. There was definitely a dim pulsation. Every few seconds, the glass brightened just a bit and then dimmed, in sync with the thumping sound. My body reacted before my mind could process it. My heart rate spiked again. I flicked the flashlight back on, feeling safer with some light in my hand. I stepped closer to the window. I reached out a trembling hand to the latch. My name whispered again, urgent and drawn out. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the latch, feeling the rust scrape against my fingers. A jolt of cold shot through my arm, almost painful, like I had touched dry ice. I yanked my hand back. My fingertips tingled. I shook my hand, trying to get the feeling back. I stared at the latch. It hadn't budged. I kept hearing the voice whispering my name, but I noticed something else. My name was being repeated with the same cadence each time, like a loop. The voice never changed pitch or speed. It sounded unnatural. That made me feel even more uneasy. It was like a recording stuck on repeat. I tried to speak out loud again. "Stop it." My voice echoed in the empty room, and for a second, the whispering paused. Then it resumed, more urgent. I decided I needed a moment away from this. I stepped back to the door, opened it, and went into the hallway. I leaned against the wall, breathing hard. My shirt clung to my back. My body felt hot despite the cold air. My mind raced, thinking about what I should do. I didn't want to leave empty-handed, so I grabbed my notebook and wrote down everything that happened. The hissing voice, the heartbeat sound, the window pulsing. I tried to keep my handwriting steady, but my hand shook a bit. While I scribbled my notes, I heard a soft tapping behind me. I turned around, shining my flashlight back into the room. It was empty. The tapping continued, coming from the window. I felt cornered. I thought about just running downstairs, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the possibility of discovering something no one else had. I was scared, but also determined. I told myself I'd give it one more chance. I'd try to open the window just to see if anything changed. Then I'd leave. I entered the room again, stepping carefully. My boots scraped the cracked floor. The tapping grew louder as I approached. The window's glow pulsed, and the cold draft in the room intensified. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. I slowly reached for the latch again. The voice continued, hissing my name, repeating in a loop. My heart thudded in my chest. My fingers wrapped around the latch and I pulled. The metal resisted. I pulled harder. It gave a bit, squeaking as the rust ground against the frame. The window didn't open yet, but I felt it shift. The voice hissed sharply, almost like it was scolding me. My fingers slipped and I stumbled backward. The notebook fell from my jacket pocket. I reached down to grab it, and the flashlight beam flickered across the dusty floor. That was when I saw something near the base of the window, footprints in the dust. They led right up to the glass and then ended. It looked like someone had stood there facing the window. The footprints were faint, but definitely shaped like shoe prints. I counted maybe 2 sets overlapping each other. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. I stood up, shining my flashlight around again. The hiss drew my attention back to the window. It felt like something was on the other side, waiting. My hands tingled and my stomach tightened. The latch was partially undone. I stepped closer. I tugged on it again, ignoring the cold bite on my fingers. The voice hissed louder, then dropped into a low moan. I felt my spine tense. My muscles jerked, but I kept pulling. The latch gave another inch, and I felt the lock release. The window didn't swing open on its own. It stayed closed, but now the lock was undone. My heart hammered. My mouth went dry. I stood there, uncertain. I lifted my free hand and pressed my palm against the glass. It felt like ice. My breath came out in quick bursts. The glass vibrated under my hand, like there was a pulse inside. I shut my eyes for a moment, but I couldn't keep them closed for long. I pulled my hand away. The glass was dry, but my palm felt damp with sweat. The voice repeated my name again, stretched out, almost quivering. I couldn't record it. I couldn't prove it. I just knew it was there, urging me to cross some threshold. I thought about what might happen if I opened that window completely. I can't explain the feeling. My mind was split between terror and a strange sense of curiosity. I felt shaky. My legs trembled. My heart pounded so loud it hurt my ears. I looked at that window for a long time. The building around me felt silent, as if everything else had stopped existing. I finally stepped back. I bent down, picked up my notebook and stuffed it into my backpack. I felt a surge of adrenaline, like I needed to get out of there. I didn't want to open that window. I didn't want to find out what might happen. The voice kept hissing, calling my name. The glass kept pulsing. My body felt tense and drained at the same time. I walked backward toward the door, never taking my eyes off the window. My flashlight's beam caught glimpses of the dusty floor and walls. I grabbed the doorknob behind me, turned it, and slipped back into the hallway. As I headed to the stairwell, the sound of the hissing grew fainter. By the time I reached the first set of stairs, I could barely hear it, but I felt it echoing in my ears. I hurried down the steps. My breathing was fast and my chest felt tight. I didn't stop until I got to the ground floor. I stepped outside and inhaled the cold night air. My hands shook as I locked my backpack and checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls, and no evidence of what I heard. I stood there on the sidewalk, looking up at the dark windows of that building. The top floor was barely visible. All I saw was a faint glimmer. My legs felt weak, but I managed to walk away, telling myself I'd come back someday to figure out what that window really was. For now, I couldn't handle it. My chest still felt heavy, and my skin was clammy. I kept hearing the voice in my head, repeating my name in that sibilant tone. I plan to check my notes later, maybe see if there are any records about that building's 16th floor. But right now, all I can do is stand here, replaying that moment in my mind. I don't have any proof. I only have my notebook and the memories. The static recordings offer no explanation. All I know is, something was in that top floor room. Something called for me by name, and I almost answered. I never expected to find a narrow passage inside the walls of my own home. The building is old, sure, but I figured any hidden spaces would have been sealed up or discovered long ago. That all changed the night I heard the scratching, sharp, irregular sounds that came from somewhere near the living room. I thought it might be rodents at first. I even set a couple of traps, but nothing turned up. Then the scratching turned into faint scraping noises, almost like nails against wood, and I knew it wasn't coming from any animal. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where the sounds originated. I traced it to a corner by the fireplace, and that's when I noticed a thin sliver of space behind the wall. It took me a few tries to move the heavy armchair and slip a thin flashlight beam through the gap, but I saw an opening, and that's how I found the passage. I rent the top floor of a century-old apartment building. The place has thick walls, ornate moldings, and floors that creak with every step. I like the character of it, but I've also had to deal with weird plumbing and outdated wiring. Still, I never suspected there might be something hidden behind the plaster. My curiosity took over, and I spent the rest of that evening chipping away at the brittle material around the gap until I could fit my shoulders through. The passage was just wide enough for me to slide in sideways. I remember pressing my ear to the opening before going in. I heard nothing but my own breathing. Then I squeezed inside. The interior of that space was cramped. My shirt snagged on rough edges of old wood. I felt dust clinging to my skin and hair, and the air smelled stale, like rotted drywall mixed with something moldy. As I moved forward, the beam from my flashlight revealed a dark, claustrophobic corridor running between the plaster and the outside wall. It connected to other hollow spaces behind the structure, almost like a maze. At that moment, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Part of me wanted to back out immediately, but I pushed forward, drawn by the idea that there might be more to discover. A few yards in, I came across markings on the wooden support beams. They looked like letters, but they weren't in any language I recognized. They were carved deep into the wood with small, rough edges that made me think they were old. My heart thumped harder as I ran my fingers over the grooves. I felt something gritty in the carved lines, like dried residue or dust. The more I saw, the more unsettled I became. There were symbols, too, circles and triangles arranged in patterns. I had no idea what they meant. I took some quick photos with my phone and tried not to think about what kind of person had left these inscriptions. That first trip into the walls lasted about 20 minutes before I got too anxious to continue. My knees were shaking, and I kept imagining that the narrow space might collapse on me. When I finally backed out and returned to my living room, I noticed the armchair was in a slightly different position than I'd left it. It was almost unnoticeable, just a few inches off. I assumed I'd bumped it when I came through, so I brushed it off, but the seed of unease had been planted. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. I woke up early, feeling unrested and tense. I grabbed a coffee, stared at the portion of the wall I had chipped away, and decided to investigate more thoroughly. I told myself I'd set up my phone to record audio in there, just in case. I folded a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket, and then slipped back into the passage. This time, I went farther. The corridor was tight, and I had to turn sideways to slide between certain beams. My flashlight occasionally caught glimpses of other inscriptions, more of those strange letters and symbols. Some were etched directly into the brick, not just the wooden studs. I also found old nails hammered into the beams in clusters. They looked handmade, with irregular shapes. About 10 minutes in, I started hearing soft creaks like wood expanding under weight. It didn't sound like my own movements. It came from somewhere ahead of me. I froze, pressing my back against the rough wall. My heart pounded so hard it made my ears ring. The light from my flashlight wobbled across the boards. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it might just be old beams settling. But the noise came in short bursts, like footsteps. Then it stopped. I couldn't see anything out of place, so I took a few more steps forward. My foot brushed against something on the floor, a small metal object that clinked against my shoe. I bent down and picked it up. It was an old key, rusted and worn. I held it in my palm, wondering how it got there. My body felt cold, and I realized I was sweating. I continued until the passage opened up slightly into a vertical shaft that ran along a row of pipes. From there, I could see faint lines of light seeping through the cracks of the wall. It looked like I was behind my bedroom closet or maybe near the hallway. I couldn't tell for sure. The air felt heavier in this spot. There was a foul smell that reminded me of wet basement floors. I tried to keep breathing shallow. Then the scratching started again, behind me this time. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the corridor. Nothing moved. But the sound persisted, as if something was raking its claws against a beam. It only lasted a few seconds, then silence. I decided I'd had enough. I slowly made my way back, careful to keep my flashlight pointed ahead so I could see where I was going. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I was relieved when I stepped back into my living room. After that second exploration, things got stranger in my apartment. I started noticing small changes in the layout of the furniture. My coffee table would be slightly angled one morning, or the bookshelf would have a gap on the left side instead of the right. I asked the landlord if he had come in while I was out, but he denied it. I tried to dismiss these oddities, but every time I turned around, something else seemed off. The floor plan felt different, as if certain walls had shifted. I could have sworn the hallway to my bedroom was narrower one afternoon than it had been the day before. I even measured it in desperation, but the numbers were inconclusive. I thought I was going crazy. I decided to confront my confusion by going back into the passage. That was my third time. I felt driven to record everything on video, so I strapped a small camera to my forehead with a headband. I tested the light, the focus, then climbed into the gap again. This time, I ventured deeper than before. I crawled through a portion that required me to duck under some pipes. The floor felt damp in places, and every so often I heard creaks above me, like someone walking overhead. But I lived on the top floor. Nobody should be above me. The realization made my stomach knot up. I wanted to turn back, but I forced myself forward. As I turned a tight corner inside the wall, the camera light illuminated more inscriptions on the beams. They looked more intricate, like they'd been carved with care. Some of the letters had lines crossing through them. Others were repeated so many times they formed entire blocks of markings. I ran my hand over one set of symbols and felt how deep the carving went. My fingertips brushed over jagged edges that felt fresh, not worn smooth by time. That made me jump back. I turned the camera toward the floor and noticed footprints in the dust. They were faint, but they definitely weren't mine. The size seemed similar to my own shoe, but I could see the pattern of a different tread. My legs felt weak. I thought about leaving, but I pressed on, determined to see where this would lead. A few steps further, I came to a junction that branched into two narrow paths. The right path led deeper into darkness. The left seemed to angle toward a part of the building I hadn't checked yet. I took the left, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too hard. The corridor ended at a wide section of rotted paneling. There was a large set of symbols painted, not carved, on the panel. The paint looked dark, maybe black or brown. I couldn't determine its exact color with the flashlight. I leaned in, seeing that the lines of paint were bumpy, as if it had been layered on thick. And then I heard a whisper. It sounded like a single word, very faint. I snapped my head around, shining the light behind me. No one was there. My breath caught in my throat. I stood absolutely still, straining to hear anything else. Only silence. I tried to calm down by wiping the sweat off my forehead. Then I took a closer look at the painted symbols. I could see letters that resembled the earlier carvings, plus a new shape, like an elongated hexagon with small lines radiating from each corner. I didn't understand any of it. I just felt dread rising in my chest. Suddenly I heard a soft scratching again, from the direction of that rotted panel. The wood quivered, like something was on the other side. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I held the camera steady, but my flashlight flickered. The batteries were starting to die. I cursed under my breath. Then the scratching turned into a faint tapping, followed by what sounded like a low moan. I'd never heard anything like it. It wasn't an animal. It was too deep, too deliberate. I backed away, almost tripping over a loose board. That was it. I knew I had to get out. My body felt hot, and my shirt clung to my skin. I retraced my steps as fast as I could without losing my footing. The entire time I thought I heard soft footsteps following me, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. I burst back into my living room in a panic. I didn't bother to seal the opening right away. I sat on the floor breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, I reviewed the camera footage. Most of it was too dark and shaky, but there were moments when I could hear faint whispers, or something like distant breathing that didn't match my own. I showed it to a friend, who suggested it might just be echo or interference. I wasn't satisfied with that explanation. My friend also noticed how those footprints in the dust looked fresh. That spooked him, but he shrugged it off, saying maybe maintenance people had used the passage in the past. That didn't explain the shapes and carvings. Over the following week, the occurrences in my apartment escalated. I would leave the living room to grab something in the kitchen and return to find a chair turned around. Drawers I knew I had closed would be open. My bedroom door would close on its own, and the handle would sometimes rattle at night. I stopped sleeping well. I lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting for noises. Most nights I heard faint clicking sounds in the walls, along with soft rustling. I started carrying a flashlight with me everywhere, even into the bathroom. The worst part was the sense that the layout of the rooms was shifting. The angles of the walls seemed different on certain days. I stood in the hallway and felt like the door to my bedroom was a few inches off from where it had been the night before. It was subtle, but alarming. I tried talking to the landlord again. He said the building was old and not always structurally sound. He claimed the floors might have some uneven spots, but I knew that didn't account for everything I was experiencing. He insisted no one had been inside my unit. I didn't bother mentioning the inscriptions. I knew he'd just tell me it was old graffiti or something else that wouldn't help me. So I went back into the passage for one last exploration. This time, I planned to mark certain areas with chalk to see if I could track any changes. I slipped in, carrying an extra flashlight and some colored chalk. I drew small X marks on the wood every few yards. I also put marks on the floor. The corridor was silent, except for the occasional groan of old boards. As I moved deeper, I noticed that some of my old footprints were gone, almost like the dust had been disturbed or swept away. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I could see faint scuff marks that didn't match my shoes, heading in a direction I hadn't explored before. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to follow them. I tried to keep quiet, moving slowly. The corridor led to a chamber-like area behind the stairwell. I'd never known such a space existed. It was about 6 feet wide, with decaying boards overhead. In the center, there was a small makeshift table of sorts, just a plank of wood resting on 2 bricks. On it lay a bundle of dried sticks tied together with what looked like old twine. Underneath the sticks was a piece of parchment or leather, covered in those strange characters. My mouth felt dry as I knelt down to get a closer look. I reached out to touch the writing, but I hesitated. The air smelled of old earth and something pungent, like a chemical or herb. I shone my flashlight on the parchment. The characters were drawn in thick lines of a dark substance, maybe ink. Without warning, I heard a hiss behind me, like a sharp intake of breath. I jumped and spun around, nearly dropping my flashlight. The beam swept across the chamber, but I saw nothing except dust particles floating in the air. My heart hammered. I backed away from the makeshift table, keeping the light pointed ahead. The hiss came again, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. I turned to leave, but the corridor behind me seemed different. The passage looked narrower. I could still fit, but the boards were at an angle as if they had shifted. I had no choice but to squeeze through. My shoulders scraped the wood. Splinters jabbed into my forearm. I swore under my breath, ignoring the pain. I kept moving, one step at a time, convinced something was right behind me. After a few minutes of inching my way forward, I reached the opening to my living room. I scrambled out, breathing hard and dripping with sweat. The opening was smaller. I don't know how, but the gap was tighter than before, and fresh plaster bits were scattered on the floor. I kicked them away in frustration, then covered the hole with a sheet of plywood I'd found in the basement. I didn't seal it completely, but I blocked it well enough to stop me from going back in. For the next several days, I tried to ignore the sounds. I tried to act like everything was normal. But at night, the building's walls made subtle popping noises, as if the space behind them was shifting again. Sometimes I heard whispers, too soft to make out any words, but definitely there. Now, every time I walk through my apartment, I pay attention to the position of every piece of furniture. If a chair is moved even an inch, I notice. A week ago, I would have thought I was going nuts. But I know better. There's something, or someone, in those walls. I don't know what they want. I don't even know if they're human. I only know that the carvings, the footsteps, the whispers, and the realignment of walls and furniture keep happening. They aren't random. The building feels alive in a way that sets my teeth on edge. I plan to move out soon, but part of me hesitates. What if leaving doesn't solve the problem? What if the building's secrets follow me? I haven't been back into that corridor since. I still have the camera footage and the photos of the symbols, but I don't show them to anyone anymore. There's no point in convincing others. I hear the noises at night, and I see the subtle shifts in my living space. That's enough proof for me. So I sit here hearing the faint scraping in the walls as I write this down. I can't explain what's behind there. I only know I found something I wish I hadn't. And whenever I think about investigating again, I feel a clenching in my chest that stops me from lifting the plywood cover. I keep my tools locked in a closet now, so I won't be tempted to pry further. I check my arm sometimes, the spot where the splinters stuck me. The skin is still tender. It's a reminder of how real this is. Nothing in those narrow spaces feels safe. The building changes when you're not looking, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever lurks inside those walls is waiting for another chance to show itself. I'm not sure how much longer I can endure it, but for now, I remain here, eyes open, ears alert, heart pounding with every subtle creak.